how they came to consume ethylene glycol?
Most of them are either accidental or suicidal, and there was one that I believe was homicidal.
How do you treat a patient with ethylene glycol poisoning? Do they all die?
No, they don't.
And how do you treat them?
Well, we have a very specific antidote that is called fameprazole. And I think we'll talk about this more later, but it is a specific antidote to treat ethylene glycol poisoning. And then we also can treat them with hemodialysis.
So as it relates to your work as a medical toxicologist, which is what you're here for today, have you testified in previous drug overdose cases?
Yes.
And have you testified in previous ethylene glycol poisoning cases?
Yes.
And do you know how many times you've testified in ethylene glycol cases?
Twice before today.
Dr. Carroll, I want to talk to you about the work that you did in the Mark Jensen case. Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 112.
I can't.
Dr. Hale, do you recognize that exhibit?
I do.
And what is that?
This is my report that I prepared in this case.
I want to talk to you about some of the information in the report that you prepared in this case. And one of the things I want to talk to you about is the methodology you use when you receive a case file and the work that you do in order to come up with an opinion. Can you tell us a little bit about that methodology?
Well, frequently when I'm asked to review a toxicology related case, I'm being asked a cause of death opinion. And even though I am a medical toxicologist, I am first and foremost an emergency physician. So I don't approach the cause of death just with toxicology blinders on. I first rule out traumatic causes of death, which is important in any death case. Secondly, looking for natural causes of death, including what someone's underlying medical history is, which is of course important, followed by the findings on the autopsy. Thirdly, considering an arrhythmia. An arrhythmia is an abnormal heart rhythm. And once somebody dies, there's nothing you can see on autopsy that says an arrhythmia occurred. So in medicine, we call it a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning you don't find anything else on the autopsy. And so looking at the circumstances may lead you to believe an arrhythmia occurred. And then finally, looking at the toxicology causes of death, which includes, of course, looking at what is in the post-mortem toxicology testing, but not hanging your hat on the exact number, because you have to correlate the findings in the toxicology test post-mortem with peri-mortem circumstances.
And do you review any police reports or discovery?
Yes, it's important to review police reports, obviously the autopsy report, the toxicology testing, and scene photos, and of course nowadays looking at cell phone footage, cell phone text messages, social media accounts, everything goes into that methodology.
And in Mr. Jensen's case, did you review all those materials you just discussed with the jury?
Minus cell phone text messages, of course.
And that's included in your report, your review and your explanation of those things?
Yes.
I want to talk specifically about ethylene glycol. Is ethylene glycol toxic?
In and of itself, it is not.
And as a medical toxicologist who also teaches as an adjunct professor, I think you might be in the best position to teach this jury a little bit about how ethylene glycol becomes toxic.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you to stand up. I'm going to give you my handheld microphone and ask you to tell us the stages in which ethylene glycol turns into a toxin.
Okay. Is this working? Yes. All right. Okay, so it's first important to understand the Now, this is not me being condescending. This is exactly how we teach our doctors in training at the Poison Center. So first, what I want you to understand is if you go out and have some wine or some beer later, that substance is ethanol. After you drink ethanol, an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, which I'm going to abbreviate as ADH, metabolizes ethanol to acetaldehyde. And then an enzyme called aldehyde dehydrogenase which I'm going to abbreviate as ALDH, metabolizes this aldehyde to acetate, which is also known as acetic acid, which is the chemical in vinegar. Now, our bodies are specifically trained or designed to take that substance off and detoxify it through something called the Krebs cycle, which is not important, but just so you know, this is what makes ethanol not toxic to humans. Now, let's talk about ethylene glycol. Now, the reason why I underlined the OL is because that's the chemistry way of knowing that something is an alcohol. So with ethylene glycol, it must go through the enzyme ADH, alcohol dehydrogenase. And that makes a compound called glycoaldehyde. And now glycoaldehyde goes through aldehyde dehydrogenase, and it ultimately makes glycolic acid, glyoxylic acid, and oxalic acid. Now, I've simplified this, but it's critical in understanding. So, just as ethanol causes somebody to become drunk, that is what ethylene glycol does. Is it, because it's an alcohol, will cause you to become drunk.
So when we're talking about glycolic acid,
Glyoxylic acid.
glyoxylic acid and oxalic acid, why is it important to understand that ethylene glycol becomes those three acids?
So what's critical to understand here is our Krebs cycle does not siphon away these acids out of our body. And so it is the accumulation of these acids in our body that make ethylene glycol to be known as a toxic alcohol. And what's even more important to understand is these are enzymes, alcohol dehydrogenase and aldehyde dehydrogenase. These are the enzymes that make ethylene glycol go from some not toxic, other than being drunk, alcohol, to something that harms our body. And so these enzymes are different in different people. Some work faster in some people, some work slower. For example, you've heard of how Asians may flush after they drink alcohol. That's because they have an issue with their aldehyde dehydrogenase. So this gets stuck back here and it accumulates, and that causes them to flush more. This is also the compound that makes somebody feel a hangover. So this is the rate determining step. If any of you ever took chemistry, even high school chemistry, you might remember the rate determining step. And so it's not like you can drink a bunch of ethylene glycol and drop dead all of a sudden, or even in a short period of time, because you have to wait for this alcohol dehydrogenase to do its first step. Now, people may ask, and they do, how long does that take? And the answer is, it's different in different people, because we are all not the same. But it can take up to several hours. And so this whole process takes time, which is why ethylene glycol poisoning is not a rapid death under any stretch of the imagination.
So Dr. Hale, if I took a big amount, 30, 50, 100 milliliters of ethylene glycol, I wouldn't immediately die?
No.
Why not?
Because of these steps that have to happen. You have to wait in line as an ethylene glycol molecule for the attention of alcohol dehydrogenase to convert you to something toxic. And the interesting thing, just so you understand this concept of alcohol dehydrogenase, is in the olden days, before there was this antidote for ethylene glycol poisoning called fameprazole, we treated ethylene glycol poisoning with ethanol, with the hope that it would compete for the attention of alcohol dehydrogenase. And so, believe it or not, back in the olden days, if somebody accidentally drank ethylene glycol, perfect first aid would get them to be drinking whiskey on the way to the emergency department, because it competes for this molecule, this enzyme.
Dr. Hale, you talked a little bit about this medication that is used to treat ethylene glycol poisoning, right?
Yes.
And what is that called again?
Fameprazole.
Fameprazole. Is that F-O-M-E-P-I-Z-O-L-E?
Yes, fameprazole works right here.
Dr. Hale, we heard from Dr. Mainland that if someone gets medical intervention, it would mean that the amount of ethylene glycol in their blood would decrease. Is that consistent with the information you know?
That is incorrect.
And can you tell us what fameprazole does as it relates to ethylene glycol poisoning? And why that would be incorrect?
Sure. So, as I have pointed out, this is the rate determining step for this conversion. Fameprazole blocks ADH. So fameprazole slows that down or blocks it. So as you can imagine, if you block this, you're keeping all of the ethylene glycol as ethylene glycol. So it is completely counterintuitive and wrong that giving fameprazole decreases the ethylene glycol level. It actually makes the ethylene glycol stick around longer. In fact, if you went out to drink at a bar and you happened to take fameprazole before you went, you would stay intoxicated a lot longer because the ethanol would stick around a lot longer. Now, that would be a very expensive night because fomepizole can be $1,000 to $2,000 a vial, but still. So if fomepizole works here at the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, it keeps ethylene glycol as ethylene glycol. And it makes this stay around longer because we don't care that it's there. And even though this transformation generally happens in the liver, a good percentage of ethylene glycol, maybe let's say 20%, but of course that can vary, will go into the urine as ethylene glycol. And so giving fomepizole helps shunt this pathway of ethylene glycol going out in your pee, as opposed to going through ADH to turn into these toxic acids.
So the medication actually keeps the ethylene glycol in your system.
Right. It doesn't decrease it. It actually keeps it sticking around longer.
And that's in hopes of keeping it from becoming the acid.
Exactly.
And is that because the acid is the toxin?
Exactly.
So someone who is given the medication is actually going to have ethylene glycol in their system longer. It's not going to be less ethylene glycol.
Correct.
The other thing I want to talk about is the acids that we have. When they become toxins, we heard Dr. Mainland talk about a body being acidic. Is this that point?
Yes. And so I know that you guys have probably heard about the stages of ethylene glycol poisoning. And I want you to understand that the stages of ethylene glycol poisoning are theoretical boundaries.
Why do you say they're theoretical boundaries?
Because if you kind of think about, I think a good example is for those of you who have maybe studied history, and they talk about certain ages in historical time. It's not like you go from medieval times or the Middle Ages and boom, on December 13th, 1453, it turns into the Renaissance or something like that, okay? They are designed to help understand what was going on. The same is true in these stages. And so the first stage is when this ethylene glycol is floating around as ethylene glycol. And so this is where we get drunk. Now, drunk is not a medical term, so we would call this central nervous system intoxication. Now, it's not like all of a sudden all the ethylene glycol went away and stage 1 is over, and now, thus hence, heretofore, we are going into stage 2. Now, stage 2 has a name called the cardiorespiratory phase. I like to think of it more as the acid phase. And when somebody has acids in their blood, then you develop an acidosis. And so the first acid that is formed is this glycolic acid. And this is what starts contributing to the acidosis. And this glycolic acid can stick around for a long time, but it also gets transformed to these other acids. So in this stage, as you become more acidotic, for any reason in medicine, like if you've ever heard of diabetic ketoacidosis, your pH, which is normally 7.4, will start going down. And in severe diabetics with diabetic ketoacidosis, I've seen them go down to 6.9. And the same thing can happen in ethylene glycol. And if you know anything about chemistry, you might think this is not a huge change, but it is. Every time you go from 7.4 to 7.3 to 7.2, it has profound effects on your body. And one of the things that our body likes to do to breathe off an acid is to breathe faster. So you're going to hyperventilate. To try to breathe off this acid. And then finally, you start developing the oxalic acid. And oxalic acid loves to team up with calcium in our bodies and make calcium oxalate crystals. And these go everywhere, okay? But where you hear it most about depositing would be in the kidneys.
So Dr. Hill, I have a couple questions as we're going through the stages. You just said that, like when we transform, to different eras in history, it's not like 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours. How come we don't know exactly when someone is out of stage 1 and in stage 2, or out of stage 2 and in stage 3?
Well, first of all, it comes down to how fast somebody's alcohol dehydrogenase works for them. There are genetic variations, there are differences in sex, and so there are reasons why this can vary from person to person. The other thing is that in a living person, there are labs that we can send that help us know which stage somebody is in. And we have some postmortem labs on Julie Jensen, but many of the labs that I would look at when I'm treating a living patient are not able to be done in a dead patient. And so it makes it a little bit harder to discern exactly which stage we're in. And as I'll explain in a moment, it's not like all of a sudden you go from one to the next. These are going to have some overlap. And there are times when I have individuals that still have a lot of ethylene glycol in their blood, but they are already developing an acidosis, and they may have calcium oxalate in their kidneys.
So it's fair to say, from what you just explained to us, that the stages can overlap.
Absolutely.
Are there studies about the stages in humans as it relates to ethylene glycol?
No. One
Why
of the
not?
problems with medical toxicology is the ethical issues with doing studies in patients. So I would not be allowed to administer ethylene glycol to all of you and then start drawing blood. That would be frowned upon. And so we don't do that in medicine. So it's very, very difficult to define what is an exact lethal dose. We can look at past studies and past ingestions, but there are no studies that truly help define that.
So I want to get to what you were talking about in stage 2, when the oxalic acid teams with calcium. And you said it's at that point that we get these crystals that form.
Yes.
And why is that so bad for the human body?
Well, calcium is a very important electrolyte or mineral in our body. And there are a lot of enzymes in our body, kind of like alcohol dehydrogenase is an enzyme. We have many others that depend on calcium. Our heart beating depends on calcium. Our muscles moving depend on calcium. And so as this oxalic acid is like a sink sucking up the calcium in our body. And that is going to make the calcium circulating in our blood and in our body go really low. And this can precipitate things like seizures and abnormal heart rhythms. And if you develop an abnormal heart rhythm, then you can die suddenly.
And is that called arrhythmia?
An arrhythmia.
So when the oxalic acid teams up with calcium, it's basically, are you saying it's taking the calcium from our body?
Yes.
And it's that taking the calcium from our body that we need that could cause these seizures or arrhythmia.
Yes.
And what happens if you get an arrhythmia?
You can drop dead.
Now, after stage 2, and I know there's no set time and these stages can overlap, what do you see in patients?
This is the most common stage for people to die in if untreated. But if you make it to stage 3, this is called the renal phase. And this is where the calcium oxalate crystals that have deposited in the kidneys. Now, I already told you these crystals can deposit everywhere. They can go to the brain, they can go to the heart, but specifically in the kidneys, they can deposit and cause destruction. Now, I know that you guys saw a pathological slide of the renal tubules with those crystals in them. Those crystals are like kidney stones in a way. If you've ever had a kidney stone and it's ripping apart in your collecting duct system, it's causing bleeding, it's causing destruction. This is happening at a more microscopic level. And so it disrupts these very critical renal tubules and you get renal failure. Once you're in both of these stages, fomepizole doesn't do much good anymore because these have already passed through these stages. And once you're here, you have to have dialysis.
Dr. Hill, have you treated individuals in stage 2 and stage 3?
Yes, and again, remember these are overlapping. So I have had patients in stage 2 that have developed renal injury. But of course, because they're in the healthcare setting, we are going to treat them with dialysis.
And those patients that you have had in stage 2, stage 3, even if they're overlapping, can you tell us what the mental status of those patients was?
So we've obviously talked about how in stage 1, you have this drunkenness, and that is altered mental status. But think about being drunk with alcohol. Just because you're drunk doesn't mean that you can't do stuff. Okay. In fact, unfortunately, there are people that drink and drive, and some more successfully than others. But the point is that this is nothing more than being drunk. When you get to these stages, there is nothing about being acidotic that makes you comatose or completely out of your mind. I see plenty of diabetic ketoacidosis patients that become acidotic and they're sick and they're uncomfortable and they're miserable, but I can still talk to them as a physician and have a doctor-patient conversation. So there's nothing about the mental status specifically from this or this that ethylene glycol would make you unable to think and do stuff. Now, there are times when these calcium oxalate crystals can deposit in the brain and cause swelling, and that would cause some altered mental status. And in the end stages of renal failure, where a compound called BUN, or your blood urea nitrogen, this is a test that you get when you go for a physical at your doctor to check your kidneys. If this goes really, really high, then this can cause some altered mental status. But in and of itself, just being acidotic, having these compounds present, doesn't render you comatose and unable to do things.
We heard from Dr. Mainland that Ms. Jensen had some mental status impairment on December 2nd and December 3rd. Is that caused by the ethylene glycol and the acidosis?
It is not caused by the acidosis. It can be caused by several things. One, ethylene glycol that was still ethylene glycol and had not been transformed yet. And then there were several other medications present that really cloud the picture about her mental status, including Ambien, including Librium, including Benadryl, and to a much lesser extent, Paxil.
Now, someone who is in acidosis, are they immobile? Are they unable to like walk or get up?
No,
Are they unable to have a conversation?
they can have a conversation.
And would someone in acidosis be able to use a telephone?
Yes,
Would they be able to use a computer?
yes,
Now, as a medical toxicologist, you're also familiar with Ambien.
I am.
And can you tell us a little bit about how Ambien could cause a change in mental status?
Ambien is a medication. The generic name is Zolpidem, and it works at certain receptors in your brain to make you go to sleep. Now, one of the strange things about this medication is that if you don't take it when you're literally in bed to fall asleep, and your idea is, I'm going to go do some things, I'm going to take it, go do some things, and then go to bed. There have been many, many stories and anecdotes about individuals sleepwalking, making sandwiches in the middle of the night, going out naked and partying in the street, and in some very unusual cases, committing murders. So Ambien has a unique effect on different people to cause them to behave in unusual ways.
Thank you. Is there anything else on the chart that you want to show us as it relates to the change of ethylene glycol into acidosis into death?
I'm going to flip the page real quick to demonstrate something. So I'm going to make a chart here. And this is time. And this is going to be concentration. So at this time 0, this is where somebody drinks ethylene glycol. And after a certain period of time, 30 minutes to 4 hours, you're going to have an ethylene glycol level. Okay, that's high. And then as time goes on, and alcohol dehydrogenase works and aldehyde dehydrogenase works, it's going to start causing this ethylene glycol level to decrease. Now, it does not go to 0 in a minute. Okay, it doesn't just drop off. So this stage 1, where you have ethylene glycol in your body, is going to last a while. It could last a day. It could last longer. So that's what I mean, that these theoretical stages don't have a defined starting and stopping place. Now, as this ethylene glycol undergoes metabolism, these acids start increasing.
Yeah, increasing.
Acids start increasing. And so they will go from non-existent and get higher and higher as the ethylene glycol goes down. So the mistake that some people make is to compare ethylene glycol levels in people that did it in a suicidal way, or accidentally drank it while they were working in their garage, or it was administered to them in a homicidal way, and compare what those levels are, which is ridiculous. Because unless you take every single one of those cases and check what the level was at the same exact time, it doesn't mean anything. Because if somebody were to happen to die early on, say here, their level is going to be high. And if this person died from ethylene glycol poisoning and they were in a later stage, their level is going to be low. So there is no way to just look at an ethylene glycol level and say, this is a suicide, this is a homicide, or this was accidental.
Dr. Hale, are you telling us that looking at the levels of ethylene glycol in the blood or in the gastric content or some other location in the body is not how you determine the manner of death?
Correct.
So in this you can sit down if you're done.
But I reserve my right to get back up and draw something if I have to.
That's fair.
Let's see.
I can take it. So Dr. Hale, we heard that Julie Jensen had 55 milligrams per milliliter or 5.5 milligrams per deciliter in her blood at the time of her death. Does that indicate a second dose to you?
No.
Why not?
Well, first let me say that the level 5.5, it's milligrams per deciliter. That's how we talk in medical toxicology of levels of alcohols. We like milligrams per deciliter. 5.5 milligrams per deciliter, I'm not even sure would show up on our send out test for ethylene glycol. It depends on the laboratory, I suppose. But we would not really consider treating somebody if that was their level, provided they didn't have any of the other metabolic derangements and calcium oxalate and stuff. So that level in and of itself would tell me not to treat a patient. We don't consider treating until above 20 milligrams per deciliter, or dialysis anywhere from 30 to 50 milligrams per deciliter. So this level of 5.5 milligrams per deciliter, in the setting of knowing that there were calcium oxalate crystals in the kidney, absolutely tells you that she was somewhere in stage 2, if not even moving into stage 3. And because that level was so low and was actually undetectable by the first lab, we know that she was very far into her poisoning.
We also heard that there was about a half a teaspoon of ethylene glycol in her stomach, gastric contents. Does that indicate, based upon the toxicology reviewed in this case, that there was a second dose?
No.
Why not?
I'm not going to do the calculations to prove it to you, and I think it's already been stipulated that it is about a half a teaspoon of ethylene glycol. Now, unless several minutes to an hour or so prior to her death, there was a consumption of a little bit of ethylene glycol, which could have happened, I believe that this was a remnant of a prior dose. And this is not whatever was left, or even if there was a second dose, there was not enough in the blood to be clinically significant. And so I believe that this is just a remnant of a prior dose.
So Dr. Hill, if I took a half teaspoon of ethylene glycol, would I need medical intervention in order to absorb and metabolize and then eliminate that ethylene glycol?
No.
How come?
That is a very small amount. I know that there was shown a NyQuil container, and that was about 30 cc's. And 30 cc's is certainly an amount that can cause you to be toxic, meaning make you go through these stages. When we talk about a lethal dose, we actually don't know what is exactly a lethal dose, because I already told you that we don't do those studies. It is thought that a potential lethal dose would be 1 to 2 milliliters per kilogram. So a potential lethal dose in somebody who is 70 kilograms would be about 70, or it could be 140. So it's 1 to 2 milliliters per kilogram. We're talking about a half a teaspoon, which is a very, very small amount. And that is likely not going to cause you to become toxic, and it is certainly not enough to be lethal.
So I heard you say kilograms, but I don't really understand what that means. Can you put that in a way that maybe I would understand what that meant?
Yes, because in the United States, we do pounds.
Correct.
Of course, in medicine, we do kilograms. But the quick way that I do it in my head is you take how many pounds you are, and you can divide it by 2 and get a ballpark. It's technically divide by 2.2, but we're doing math. That's a ballpark way of doing it.
That's good for me to know for the doctor's office. I appreciate that. I have a question about when someone takes a dose of ethylene glycol, based upon the toxicology that you've reviewed, can you determine the date and the time and the amount of the dose?
No.
In a living patient, can you determine that?
No.
What do you have to rely on in a living patient to determine the date, the time, and the dose?
Well, even in a living patient, and unless they tell you, it's difficult to pinpoint to an exact time. However, in a living patient, like I alluded to earlier, there are laboratory tests that we can send that will help delineate which stage somebody is in. And those are not tests that can be performed on a dead person. So it makes it a little bit more difficult in a dead person to define where these stages occurred and to map it backwards. But in the case of Julie Jensen, I don't have the benefit of ante-mortem or before she died blood work, but I know 3 important things. Number 1, her level was almost undetectable, implying later on in her stage of poisoning. Number 2, there were calcium oxalate crystals present in her kidneys and possibly other places that say that she was at least in stage 2, if not moving into stage 3. And thirdly, that she died.
I want to just go back a second. If you answer this, please just explain it to me again. How is there still ethylene glycol in the blood if oxalic crystals are in her kidneys?
So going back to this chart, the ethylene glycol is going down little by little over time. It does not precipitously drop off to zero. So you're going to expect a small amount in the blood still, even though you have been making these acids.
So when you treat a living patient that is in either stage 2 or stage 3, which you know from the testing you do, have you found ethylene glycol in their blood?
Yes. And in that situation where there's ethylene glycol in the blood still, we would give both fameprazole, and if they had acids in their blood and calcium oxalate in their urine, we would also dialyze them. We would do both.
If someone is acidotic, I think you talked about they would be trying to breathe out the acid.
Yes.
And would someone continue to do that until they were no longer acidotic?
Yes, of course, in a situation like this, being untreated, it's not going to necessarily get better.
The breathing out the acid isn't necessarily going to get better.
Correct.
It's not going to make somebody better because they're breathing out the acid.
Right. It's your body trying to compensate. However, if somebody is in a late stage, or if their calcium has gone so low and they are getting much sicker, they may start breathing slower.
Doctor, does the toxicology in this case tell you the cause of death to a reasonable degree of medical certainty and probability?
Yes.
And what is that?
The cause of death is ethylene glycol poisoning.
And does the toxicology in this case give you a manner of death to a reasonable degree of medical, to a reasonable degree? I just lost what I was saying. Thank you. Medical certainty or probability?
No.
What would your opinion be to a reasonable degree of medical certainty and probability as it relates to the manner of death?
Well, I would say it is undetermined. And the reason is that if somebody died by an overdose of pills and you found 20 pills in the stomach, that is most likely a suicide, unless, of course, somebody had a gun to their head and somebody was saying, here, take this pill, here, take this pill, here, take this pill. That would make sense. Because ethylene glycol is a liquid, and because it doesn't take a lot to cause toxicity and even death, it can be administered in a suicidal fashion or it can be administered in a homicidal fashion. But there is nothing in looking at an autopsy in a ethylene glycol poisoning case that is going to tell you whether it is a suicide or a homicide or an accident by virtue of the fact that this is a liquid. And so just by staying strict to the science and strict to the toxicology, you cannot determine just by the science what the manner of death is. And so I would say that the manner of death is undetermined.
Can you determine just from the science whether Ms. Jensen had more than one dose of ethylene glycol?
No.
And is that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty and probability?
Yes. Like I said, I can't tell if a few minutes before her death, there was a small amount administered. It could not have been a large amount because there was nothing in her blood. Undetectable, a small, tiny amount. So that's why I say that you cannot tell. But more so, just because there could potentially be more than one administration of ethylene glycol doesn't prove that it's homicidal or suicidal. A suicidal person can take more than one dose as well. So the premise that more than one dose occurred, which I don't believe is in reasonable medical certainty, but even if it did, it still does not tell you what is the manner of death.
Doctor, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 113. Doctor, is that a diagram that you prepared in your report consistent with the information you provided to the jury on the whiteboard?
Yes, it's a little bit more detailed, but the what I showed is a simplification of this. Sure. Thank you.
Judge, I'm going to mark the whiteboard pages as exhibits, just so we have them for the record. Does the court?
Welcome to do that.
Okay.
So.
And then I have no further questions.
What number would that be from Madam Clerk? 114? You want to mark them together, both pages?
I would move in exhibits 111, 112, 113, and 114.
Subject to cross. Do you want that exhibit left up there, Mr. Jambois?
I do.
Thank you. But it's been marked for the record. Anytime you're ready, Mr. Jambois.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Hale.
Good morning.
Welcome to Wisconsin.
Thank you.
I must say that I'm very impressed with your background, with your history, your educational attainment, and your professional qualifications. So your family must be very proud of you. Do you have parents?
Yes.
Aren't they? I bet they're very proud of you, aren't they? I mean, it's
Well,
quite a spectacular array of training and qualification and experience. I think you might be the most qualified defense expert I've ever encountered in my career. So congratulations on that. But I have some questions nonetheless. And I told defense counsel that it was going to be short, but I think it might be a little bit longer than I'd anticipated. My apologies, counsel. So let's start with this whole thing about differential diagnosis. You said that you train emergency room physicians in this?
Yes.
And so you'll stand by the bedside of a patient and you'll go through their history, and that's to assist you and your students in making a differential diagnosis.
Yes.
And so when you train your students when they're doing this differential diagnosis, that it's important to get as much information as you can that's relevant to making that diagnosis.
Yes.
And if you leave out important information, that may adversely affect the reliability of the differential diagnosis.
Yes.
Let's do an example of an analysis of, we'll take my favorite meal.
Your favorite what?
My favorite meal.
Okay.
So, and I bet your husband and I might have something in common in this regard, unless he's a vegetarian.
He's not. Trust me, we're from Texas.
Okay, so good. Then, so my favorite meal would probably consist of 2 glasses of a nice dry red wine, like a Cabernet Sauvignon, an 8 or 10 ounce bone-in ribeye steak, and a baked potato with sour cream on it. Now, as a medical toxicologist, you're familiar with the contents of that kind of a meal, right?
Yes.
And you're familiar with the effect that it has on the human body, correct?
Yes.
So let's talk about the good things in a bottle, in a glass, 2 glasses of red wine. What are some of the good things in a glass of red wine?
Well, I'm glad you asked because I actually like to study this kind of thing. I very much enjoy natural product chemistry. And red wine has a lot of what we call phytochemicals, which are chemicals from plants. And they have a lot of beneficial anti-cancer effects and cardiovascular effects. And the reason why red wine is better than grape juice is because grape juice has a lot of sugar, which is not good for you, but that's been fermented to alcohol. And in moderation, there are beneficial effects of red wine.
And then let's talk about the good things in a bone-in ribeye steak, aside from the fact that it tastes so good. It's got protein.
Yes.
Are there other good things in a ribeye steak besides protein?
Well, I haven't looked so much into ribeye steaks, but I personally prefer bison ribeyes
Oh,
because
'cause
they
they're-
are less fatty.
They're leaner, yeah. So fat's not good. You don't want fat in your diet.
Yes.
Okay. So a lean ribeye steak and a bison steak both have protein in them, and protein is good for the human body.
Yes.
And with respect to a potato, baked potato, is there anything good in a baked potato for us?
Not particularly unless they're the purple ones. The purple ones actually have some great phytochemicals in them. But I think a potato is great if you're trying to be gluten-free.
Oh, so there's no gluten in it. Okay.
Correct.
And then the sour cream, that's got calcium and other things in it. That's good for you, right?
Sure.
So, and because my wife's sitting right behind me, we're describing my favorite meal. So those are all good things about my favorite meal, right?
Well, hopefully after this trial, she'll make you your favorite meal.
No, actually, I do all the cooking in our house, but or most of the cooking, so I'll make it myself. But so 2 hours after I've had a meal of 2 glasses of red wine and a steak and a baked potato, I get hit by a car. You do blood work on me. You'll find some good stuff in me, and you'll find some maybe a little bit too much fat, and because of the fatty ribeye steak, maybe a little bit too much starch because of the starch in a potato. But that doesn't contribute to my cause of death. But there's good things and bad things in my body. Now I didn't ask you about any of the bad things in that meal. So if you're going to do an assessment about what kind of a diet a person should have, a steady diet of 2 glasses of red wine and a ribeye steak and a baked potato for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that's not a good diet, is it?
Probably not.
Because there's some bad things in there too, right?
Yes.
So in a balanced assessment of what is a good meal requires you also to assess what's bad in the items you're ingesting, correct?
I suppose.
So red wine, which has all kinds of good things in it, also has some stuff in it that's not good for you,
Correct.
like the ethanol that you've got up there. There's ethanol in red wine, and ethanol by and large is not good for human beings, right?
I think there are studies that show in moderation it has some beneficial cardiovascular effects. But obviously in excess, no.
So red wine is good for me. Thank you, doctor. Now let's talk about the differential diagnosis that physicians do and that you did in this case. When you're doing a differential diagnosis, and we're talking about, and I'm so happy to have this paper up here because I don't like computers as much as I like paper. So I'm gonna use that paper for a minute too. So bear with me for a second.
I think the marker's still up there
Right here.
and a microphone.
You have to hold it longer. Until the light comes on. It's on. It's on.
Well, what is it working? Okay, now it's working. There we go. Okay. Okay. So doctor, could I have the marker, please? Thank you. So for purposes of your testimony, your evaluation of this case, you'd actually been retained to do a differential diagnosis. Is that true?
A cause of death analysis, yes.
And well, I want to make sure that I get it right. So let's take a look at what you wrote here. You wrote in your report, I was provided the below listed case-specific materials and relied on the following to render an opinion regarding cause of death. That's
Yes.
what you did.
Well, what page was that for the record?
Page 2, Your Honor.
Thank you.
And then on page 3, you wrote, my methodology involved considering evidence regarding the scene investigation, and you considered that. I mean, you saw crime scene photos
Yes.
and case details. Well, we'll get into that in a moment, but you indicated case details.
Yes.
And pathology examination and laboratory analysis, correct?
Correct.
And then ultimately, I evaluated and balanced that evidence using the physician tool of, quote, differential diagnosis, unquote, and evidence-based medicine, as well as knowledge of the medical literature. More importantly, postmortem toxicology findings must be correlated with the scene investigation, case details, and pathology analysis in rendering a cause of death opinion. So that's what you wrote, right? And that's what you did in this case.
Yes.
Now, I notice on page 4, I'm sorry, not page 4. Could you hold this for a moment? I need both hands. Here it is, on page 6. You wrote at the top there, she acted extremely lethargic, would ramble without reason or making sense. She had lost 15 pounds during the last month alone. Now, do you know where that information came from, that you wrote she had lost 15 pounds during the last month alone?
Well, I documented that came from the Pleasant Prairie Police Department
And do you know where they got that from?
from talking to Mark Jensen.
So that information was provided to them by Mark Jensen.
Yes.
And you know for a fact that's not true, don't you? By looking at the case in this, by looking at the information that was in this case, you know for a fact that Julie Jensen had not lost 15 pounds in the last month alone.
I don't know.
Well, let's take a look at your report again. I will direct your attention to page 3 of your report. So on page 3 of your report, under pertinent case details and timeline, on September 1st, 1998, Julie Jensen went to see Dr. Borman, and she weighed 123 pounds. Does it say that there?
Yes.
And then on December 1st, she had dropped from 123 pounds to 115 pounds. You see that there?
Yes.
So between September 1st, 1998 and December 1st, 1998, we knew she had lost exactly 8 pounds.
Well, I don't know if I would say exactly, but that is what is reported in this information.
Well, of all the you do know that at the time that Julie was, at the time of her autopsy, were you aware that the forensic pathologist did not have a scale?
I heard that, yes.
So when he wrote in his autopsy report that she was approximately 110 pounds, that was his estimate of her weight by looking at her.
Probably.
Correct? So the two most reliable weights that we have for Julie Jensen was those that were from her doctor's office, correct?
Yes.
Because when I go see a doctor, the first thing I do is step on a scale. And that's what most people do when they go see a doctor.
Yes.
I mean, you go see a doctor too, don't you? Even though you are one, you go see a doctor, right?
Yes.
And does your doctor have you step on a scale?
Yes.
And they they record your weight.
Yes.
And that's what happens to all of us when we go see a doctor. We get on the scale and the doctor records our weight.
Yes.
So this September 1st, 1998 weight of 123 pounds is pretty darn accurate, wouldn't you say?
I would think so.
And this weight of 115 pounds on December 1st, 1998 is pretty darn accurate, isn't it?
I would think so.
And then the weight of 110 pounds at the time of autopsy, that's an estimate, right?
Yes.
But an estimate by a very experienced forensic pathologist, right?
Sure.
But even the estimate of a very experienced physician is probably not going to be as accurate as the weight that was recorded on a scale when you step on the scale.
I'm sure it depends in part on the scale.
Well, doctors rely upon the information that is generated in their office to make their notes, correct?
Correct.
And so they want to make sure that the information that's in their notes concerning their patient is accurate, right?
Sure.
And if it's the same scale that was stepped on September 1st and then stepped on December 1st, which is, by the way, was that almost exactly 3 months? If there is a problem with the scale, it's probably the same problem they had September 1st and December 1st. So wouldn't it be fair to say that she lost almost exactly 8 pounds between September 1st, 1998 and December 1st, 1998?
I guess so, yes.
So losing 8 pounds in 3 months is a whole lot different than losing 15 pounds in 1 month, isn't it?
Yes.
So when you're considering the source of that information about losing 15 pounds in 1 month, you might want to consider the source in deciding whether or not that is an accurate or inaccurate result. Because it's inaccurate to say she lost 15 pounds in 1 month, isn't it?
Well, maybe he was ballparking it. I mean, I'm sure that he wasn't specifically the one weighing her, but I don't think that that's a huge discrepancy.
But it is a discrepancy, and actually it is pretty big to say 15 pounds in 1 month when actually she'd lost 8 pounds in 3 or 4 months. Correct? That's a pretty big discrepancy.
It's a difference, yes.
So let's consider the motivation that Mark Jensen might have had for lying to the police about how much weight Julie Jensen had lost in the last month of her life. Might he have been trying to make it look like Julie Jensen was unstable and emotional and lost her appetite and was suicidal? Wouldn't
Judge,
that
I would
be a
argue-
good way to
I
support
would
that
object as
proposition?
argumentative.
There's an objection. What,
I would object as to argumentative.
overruled, go ahead.
That means you can answer the question, Doctor. Did you hear the question?
I felt like it was more like a speech, but if you want to ask the question again, ask it more specifically.
Okay. Would you agree that I'll ask it, I'm just going to ask a different question because I don't want to make a speech. You understand that Mark Jensen sits over there and he's accused of murder of Julie Jensen.
I understand that.
And you do understand that, now this may be a surprise to you, but you do understand that sometimes people that are accused of murder, who actually committed the murder, have a motive to lie to the police about it.
Sure.
And so you would agree that Mark Jensen, the accused murderer in this case, if in fact he murdered Julie Jensen, has a motive to lie to the police and everybody else about Julie Jensen's condition in the month or two preceding her death. Would you agree with that?
I suppose, but my role in this case is not to assess the credibility of Mark Jensen or anybody else. My role in this case is to look at the medical science.
Actually, that's not true. That's not what you wrote in your report, is it? What you wrote in your report was, my methodology involved considering evidence regarding the scene investigation, case details, pathology examination, and laboratory analysis. Ultimately, I evaluated and balanced that evidence using the physician tool of, quote, differential diagnosis, unquote, and evidence-based medicine, as well as knowledge of the medical literature. More importantly, the postmortem toxicology findings must be correlated with the scene investigation, case details, and pathology analysis in rendering a cause of death opinion. So you were looking at the scene investigation and case details and pathology analysis in rendering a cause of death opinion.
Exactly. And your question was about the credibility of certain witnesses, which is not my role in this case.
You indicated I was provided the below listed case specific materials and relied on the following to render an opinion regarding cause of death. Pleasant Prairie Police Department records,
Yes.
scene photographs,
Yes.
Dr. Borman records,
Yes.
letter to Dr. Borman,
Yes.
Dr. Borman trial testimony,
Yes.
medical records of Julie Jensen,
Yes.
Kenosha County Medical Examiner records,
Yes.
and then all these toxicology labs, St. Louis, University of Kentucky, AIT, and NMS.
What page were you reading off?
I'm sorry, page 2, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Now, and by the way, in terms of your medical toxicological analysis, would it surprise you to learn that the Dr. Mainland thought that your analysis was quite elegant and accurate, which is not surprising because you're a toxicologist. So it should stand to reason that you know a lot about poisoning and you know a lot about ethylene glycol and how it's metabolized into the system. So there's not any really great discrepancy between Dr. Mainland and you as to ethylene glycol as being a potential contributing factor to the death of Julie Jensen. We all agree that Julie Jensen was poisoned with ethylene glycol. I mean, you agree with that, right?
Yes.
And Dr. Mainland agrees with that as well. And Dr. Shambliss, for that matter, agrees that she was poisoned with ethylene glycol. The information in this case would be diagnostic for ethylene glycol poisoning, isn't it?
Yes.
So there's no question about that. The question is, what actually killed her? And the fact that she was poisoned with ethylene glycol, that does mean that she could have died from ethylene glycol poisoning, doesn't it?
Say that again.
The fact that she was poisoned with ethylene glycol, that does indicate that she could have died of ethylene glycol poisoning, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that's all you looked at was this toxicological stuff? You didn't consider all of the other information?
That is incorrect.
Yes, because I know that you considered, for example, that Mark Jensen had told the police on December 3rd that she'd lost 15 pounds in a single month, and you know that's not true.
I agree that there's a discrepancy between 8 pounds and 15 pounds. And whether there's a discrepancy in her weight or whether she lost 16 or 7 or whatever is something that I recorded in the pertinent case details, but it really doesn't play a huge role in my ultimate opinion.
Because whether the accused murderer lied to the police doesn't affect your medical analysis? You're not going to answer the question? That was a question I was put to you.
Judge, I think this is an argumentative line and not relevant as to what Dr. Hale has testified to.
We'll let the doctor answer that one question.
Can you repeat the question?
Could you read it back, please?
Because whether the accused murderer lies to the police doesn't affect your medical analysis, you're not going to answer that question. That was a question.
So right now your line of questioning is about a discrepancy in a patient's weight. And I don't really see that as necessarily a lie. And if it is a lie, it is not something that affects my analysis.
Because you're just looking at the medical information.
No, I'm looking at the totality of the evidence and getting the best history that I can, the best timeline that I can. And I consider things that Mark says. I realize that he is accused of a crime. And I realize that Julie is not here to tell us her side of the story, but there are things where in her medical records and otherwise you can essentially paint the picture of what was going on.
You know, I'm going to return to my seat for a minute. I'm going to turn this off because I'll get back to this in a little bit, but I want to return to my seat. I don't want you to get the
You
impression.
never wrote anything.
I know, but I'm going to.
Okay.
I'm just not going to, but I thought I'd better go back to my seat and sit down and go through this report a little bit more with you, okay?
Okay.
So I didn't want to give you the impression that I was kind of towering over you. I thought it'd make you more comfortable if I sat over here.
You are not making me uncomfortable.
Oh, well, good. I'm glad to hear that. So even though you're rendering an opinion as to the cause of death in this case, and it's based largely upon your qualifications, your extraordinary qualifications as a medical toxicologist, you do acknowledge that you were looking at a bunch of other stuff in this case as well.
Correct. When I'm in the emergency department setting, I can talk to my patients, or if they're unconscious for some reason, I might get the history from a friend or a family or the paramedics that bring them. And so the history is obtained that way.
So, for example, if you've got a guy that's rushed into the hospital and you ask him, well, how much you've had to drink? And he says, hey, doc, I've only had a couple of shots of whiskey. And his wife is standing right there and she says, Elmer, you had a half a bottle of whiskey. Tell this doctor the truth. At that point that you get information from a different source that might be more reliable than the information that's provided to you by the patient, right?
Well, you would consider the statements made by both individuals, and then ultimately you would have an ethanol level that might confirm who is correct or not.
So if his serum level or his blood level is a 0.32, then that it's more likely the wife was telling the truth than the guy that's telling you who you only had a couple of shots of whiskey, right?
Yes.
And so in this case, when you're listening to this, you're looking at the history of the case as well as looking at what's just in the blood and urine and stomach contents of Julie Jensen, right?
Right.
So you offered the opinion that there was no convincing evidence here that Julie had more than one dose of ethylene glycol, right?
Correct.
Are you aware that Mark Jensen told another person that he had administered 2 doses of ethylene glycol, that he administered 1 dose with a glass of orange juice in the evening of December 2nd, and then he administered a 2nd dose of ethylene glycol with orange juice the next day?
Judge, I'm only objecting to a fact, not an evidence, because it was juice, not orange juice. So I just wanted to be clear.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll say,
Well, can I make a ruling?
Please.
Can you change the juice and we can proceed?
so on December 1st, in the evening hours of December 1st, I should say, let me back up. Were you aware that Mark Jensen had told a fellow inmate in the county jail that in the evening of December 1st, 1998, he administered a dose of ethylene glycol to Julie Jensen by mixing it approximately 1/3 antifreeze and 2/3 juice? Were you aware that he had said that?
Yes.
And were you aware that he also then told that same inmate that on the next day he administered another dose of ethylene glycol, again as approximately 1/3 antifreeze and 2/3 juice? Were you aware of that?
Yes.
So you don't put that anywhere in your report, though. You didn't consider that. Why is that?
I was not aware of that at the time I wrote my report.
Oh, but now, so the time you did not know that Mark Jensen had made that statement to Aaron Dillard,
Correct.
or that at least Aaron Dillard testified that. I mean, I don't want to. Aaron Dillard is the one that testified that Mark Jensen said that to him. You weren't aware of that.
Not at the time that I wrote my report.
And were you aware of at the time that you wrote your report, that Mark Jensen had confided in a coworker, a friend of his, one night on November 7th, 1998, that he confided with his friend coworker in an intoxicated evening of wife bashing, that he'd told his coworker Ed Klug that he'd found a way to murder your wife?
No.
That he'd found a drug that will crystallize you from the inside out? Did you know that?
I believe I remember reading the crystallized from the inside out. Yes.
That's a pretty good layman's term of describing what ethylene glycol does to you, isn't it? Crystallizes you from the inside out. So were you aware at the time you wrote this report that Mark Jensen had a drunken conversation with Ed Klug in the early morning hours of November 7th, where he'd said, yeah, he was planning to kill his wife, poison her with his drug, using Benadryl and this drug and that would crystallize you from the inside out?
No,
Now you're aware of that conversation?
I am.
And you're aware that Ed Klug's wife, who's now his ex-wife, stepped up and she also testified that she corroborated what Ed Klug told her, that he called her that night and was telling her. As he was talking with Mark Jensen, he'd go up to his room and call her and tell her about this conversation he was having with Mark Jensen about how Mark Jensen was planning to kill his wife. Were you aware of that?
I am aware of that.
But not at the time you wrote this report, you weren't aware of that.
Correct.
Now, I'll say there's a lot of other stuff in terms of your differential diagnosis that the jury has heard over the past several days that you don't make reference to in your differential diagnosis. Is that because you didn't know about this other evidence?
At the time I wrote my report, I did not know about Aaron Dillard, and I did not know about Ed Klug.
Did you know about Kelly Labonte?
Yes,
So you knew that Mark Jensen had a girlfriend, a woman he was having a sexual relationship with in the months preceding Julie Jensen's death.
yes,
Did you know that Mark Jensen, that there's internet communications between Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte after they'd commenced this sexual relationship, where Mark Jensen is proposing that they run off somewhere and go on a Windstar cruise? Were you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that.
Were you aware that that conversation occurred in the middle of October 1998?
No,
Were you aware that in the middle of October 1998, Mark Jensen was in an email communication with Kelly Labonte, was proposing that they run off somewhere in 1999 on a Windstar cruise together?
no, I am not aware of that.
Well, I want you to assume hypothetically the following facts. And now I guess I'm going to go back up there to the list or to this paper. Is this working now?
No.
Now it's working. There's a few seconds delay. So, doctor, let's consider some of the things that you didn't list in your differential diagnosis. Number one, and by the way, you know, we all of us make differential diagnoses in our lives, right? We might not call it that, but we all make those kinds of diagnoses, right?
Say that again?
Don't all of us make differential diagnoses? I'll give you an example. Police officers, for example, when they're investigating a case and they're considering whether a murder suspect actually could have committed the crime, they consider motive, opportunity, and capability. Those three things are what every cop has been trained to do when they're conducting an investigation. Motive, opportunity, and capability. And that's kind of maybe the components that you need to make a differential diagnosis. Is this the guy that did it or not, right?
Well, first of all, I would argue that cops should never be rendering a diagnosis or going through the process of a differential diagnosis, and they would be the first to tell you that that is not their job. Secondly, I'm not really sure how what you just said plays a role in differential diagnosis.
Well, in a differential diagnosis, what you're doing is there's an infinite array of possibilities when you're talking to somebody, right?
Yes,
Now, when you're talking to somebody in the emergency room, you're talking to them because you want to make a differential diagnosis as to what the problem is with them so you can come up with a course of treatment, right?
yes,
So you ask that person questions so that you can make that differential diagnosis.
yes,
And don't you think that when a police officer is talking to a person who they're in the police station, they want to find out what this person has that they can tell them about the case that they're investigating, right?
Well, what the police officer's role is and what a physician's role in are two completely different things.
I didn't ask you that, though, did I? I already know that police officers don't do the same thing as medical toxicologists or emergency room physicians. And don't you think every person in the jury already knows
Judge, I would
that
object.
police officers and emergency medical room physicians do different jobs?
I think there's an objection.
There is, this is argumentative. It's not
Uh,
a question.
Overruled, go ahead.
So that means you can answer the question.
I understand what that means. The problem that I have with what you're saying is that you're saying that police officers use differential diagnosis. And so that is absolutely incorrect.
Oh. Well, what do you call it that police officers do?
They investigate a scene and they write reports and they can make decisions whether to arrest people or not, but they are not diagnosing conditions.
Well, do you think they just arrest people randomly, or do you think that when they make the arrest decision is based upon their assessment of the evidence at the scene and their conversation or communication with the suspect?
Well, obviously, it depends on the crime and it depends on the situation.
You think there are times when police officers just arrest people randomly?
Not randomly, but depending on if they are in the process of breaking into a home, then yes, they would probably arrest right away.
So the question here was, I mean, the objection was that I was being argumentative. The fact is, you're not
Sorry, I
answering
can't hear you.
The objection was that I was being argumentative, but the fact is you're the one that's arguing with me here. I mean, it's a
Gotcha.
simple
I
proposition,
would
isn't it?
object, that's
I would
argumentative.
object to that. That's just,
Well, it's a simple proposition that police officers don't go about arresting people randomly without regard to the facts that is presented to them, correct?
In general, yes.
And we all make decisions based upon the facts that are presented to us, don't we?
In the broadest and most general question I've ever heard, I guess the answer is yes.
Okay, so let's get back to the more specific question about differential diagnosis. We make a decision based upon the information that is presented to us, correct?
Correct.
And then we differentiate, we look at the information we choose to believe, we look at the information that's inconsistent with other information we've received, and then we make a decision about our next course of action, correct?
Correct. We obtain a history the best way possible and weigh all of those different facts. And some facts are more credible or less credible than others. And then we take that history and we do ancillary studies. An ancillary study might be an X-ray or a laboratory test.
It's Doctor, I appreciate.
I object to him
she,
cutting her
she was,
off while she's
okay,
answering
she was
the
being
question.
non-responsive.
finish. Go ahead, doctor, finish.
When you do a differential diagnosis, there are different components of that. There's the history, which, as I've said, you can obtain from the patient or a family member or the paramedics that bring the patient. And you weigh all of that evidence, and sometimes the evidence is incorrect, or it may not be exactly right, or there may be a discrepancy. But you consider those things, and then you look for ancillary studies, such as radiology testing, like a chest x-ray or a CAT scan of a head, or laboratory testing, or biopsies. Those are all things that are ancillary tests. And you combine all of the information. Some of it may be helpful, some of it may be incorrect, and you combine it together to render a diagnosis.
So you made reference to reliable versus unreliable information, correct?
Correct.
So there is, when you're making a differential diagnosis, there is an assessment of the reliability versus the unreliability of the information that you're receiving, correct?
To some extent, but as an emergency physician, I may not always have the ability to corroborate certain information, especially in an emergency department setting where it's fast and you're thinking on your feet. So when you get the information and you record it in the medical record, just like I recorded in my report does not include commentary about whether I believe that information or not. I am merely reporting what the evidence shows. And the same thing would occur in the medical record. When I create a medical record and the patient tells me that they just got back from a trip from Mars, then I'm going to write in the medical record, this patient just got back from a trip from Mars. Now, I realize that is an extreme example, but it gets reported.
So to get back to reliable and unreliable information, would you agree that when you're teaching your students that you suggest to them that in evaluating information, they should rely more on reliable information and less on unreliable information?
Well, I suppose when I'm teaching, I would say the same thing that I just said a minute ago, which is record what the patient tells you, record what you're told. We don't always have a way to know whether a person is reliable or not, or if it's their family member that is reliable or not. But we report what we're told, and we put that in the medical record, and we don't make an assessment of what is reliable or unreliable.
So now I'm going to approach it one more time, and this time I'm going to write something, I promise, okay? So for your differential diagnosis, you considered Pleasant Prairie Police Department records, right?
Correct.
And that's a broad category. But did the Pleasant Prairie Police Department records include the email communications that I just described to you between Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte in mid-October 1998?
I don't believe they included any email communications, and I can't say for sure whether the police records reported that or not.
So I've got homicide on one side and suicide on the other. My handwriting's not very great, but maybe I should make this a little bit clearer. So homicide and suicide. So we're going to do a differential diagnosis here. So you did not, you were unaware of, or you did not consider the fact that Mark Jensen had a girlfriend on the side in the months preceding Julie Jensen's death.
Judge, I'm going to object to the homicide and suicide being up there. That's a determination for the jury.
Yeah, but he's asking questions about it. I think the jury's smart enough to figure out he's just asking a question.
I agree with you, Judge. I think he
So
could do
we're
the
going to let it go.
thing with facts versus no facts. I'm just saying.
Can Mark what he
That's fine.
wishes.
That's fine.
You can redirect and
I
ask
will.
your expert
That
what
sounds
you
great.
wish. Go ahead.
So for your differential diagnosis, you didn't consider the email communications between Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte in the months preceding Julie Jensen's death.
No, and just
That's sufficient. Just no, you did not.
Judge,
Correct?
again, I object to him not letting her finish her answer.
Well, Your Honor, the fact is it was a yes or no question. And so she should answer no. And she likes to lecture a lot. I mean, she's talking to me lecturing. She lectures a lot. I just want to know, you did not consider Mark Jensen's communications with Kelly Labonte in the months preceding Julie's death. Yes or no?
no,
You did not consider the fact that Mark Jensen was having a sexual relationship with Kelly Labonte in the months preceding Julie Jensen's death.
no,
You did not consider the fact that Mark Jensen lied about that relationship to the investigating officer when he was asking him questions about Kelly Labonte. You did not consider that either, did you?
no,
You did not consider the fact that Mark Jensen, there's evidence that this jury has heard, that Mark Jensen, in the years preceding Julie Jensen's death, subjected her to a sadistic pattern of harassment and humiliation and demeaning behavior. You weren't aware of that, weren't you?
I was aware of that, yes.
Oh, you were aware. You were aware that Mark Jensen, in the years preceding Julie Jensen's death, had repeatedly done hang-up phone calls, had repeatedly left emails or sent her emails with penis pictures, that he'd repeatedly left penis pictures around the house for her to find. You were aware of that?
Judge, I object to the nature of the question. I think if she's aware that pictures and phone calls were had, that's different than Attorney Jamboy's indication that it was Mark Jensen.
Well, that's a jury determination.
I agree. I think that the question just isn't clear for the expert when we're talking about, was she aware of photos and harassing phone calls versus Mark Jensen being the person that did them? I think that's the problem.
He's also an expert, so.
I agree, but Attorney Jamboy's just wants a yes or no. So I'm just trying to make sure that we're clear on the question so that she doesn't say no, but, and then she can't finish her
You know what,
answer.
Judge? I'll withdraw that question.
Thank you.
So you were aware that Julie Jensen was the subject of a sadistic campaign of harassment and abuse. You were aware of that, right?
I was aware of that situation, yes.
Well, Julie Jensen had kept a log of all these patterns of harassment, correct?
I know that now, yes.
That Julie didn't know who was doing this, but somebody was calling them all the time and hanging up the phone. You were aware of that?
I was aware of that situation, yes.
It went on from early 1992 through August of 1998. You were aware of that situation?
Yes,
You were aware that in addition to the hang-up phone calls, they would, whoever was doing this would leave a series of penis photos all around the house, or that allegedly leave them at Mark Jensen's place of business, and Mark would come home and show them to her. You were aware of that?
I'm not aware of that specific scenario that you just described.
Oh, you weren't aware of the fact that Mark Jensen showed these photos that he got, that he said he got them at his office, and then he'd come home and show them to Julie. You weren't aware that he did that?
Not that specific thing, no.
Were you aware that Julie Jensen received emails with these disgusting pornographic penis photos attached to them? Were you aware of that?
Not specifically as you described.
Well, were you aware that on April 13th, 1998, Julie Jensen received an email, and she put it in her log of harassment that she received an email on April 13th, 1998?
I'm aware of the situation, but not of the specific date or specifics.
Are you aware of who actually created that email that Julie Jensen complained about on April 13th, 1998?
No,
Are you aware this jury saw that it was Mark Jensen that created that email, but made it look as though it came from Turtle to Julie Jensen? Were you aware of that?
no,
Were you aware that it actually was an email that Mark Jensen had created himself with 15 different penis photos on it, that he took out his name and put in Turtle as the person that was from, took out his name and put in the name Julie Jensen as the person it was to? Were you aware that Mark Jensen did that?
no,
Are you aware that the jury has seen very clear evidence of that? Would you agree that that kind of behavior reflects a malicious, a sadistic frame of mind on the person who would do something like that?
yes,
And would that be relevant to the issue of whether or not the person who did that on April 13th, 1998, as part of a pattern of harassment for the last several years, would have a motive to murder Julie Jensen on December 3rd, 1998?
possibly.
And would you agree that if Mark Jensen was planning to go on a cruise with his girlfriend in October of 1999, and he was talking with his girlfriend in October of 1998 about that cruise, would you agree that Mark Jensen needed to do something with his wife, correct?
I'm not going to agree with that. I would say that that makes him guilty as an adulterer, but not necessarily as a murderer.
Sure. I mean, he could have wanted to get a divorce, right?
Yes,
And he could have planned to get a divorce, right?
yes,
In fact, at the time that communication was taking place between Mark Jensen, who was married to Julie Jensen, Kelly Labonte at that point was not actually any longer Kelly Labonte. Her name was actually Kelly Greenman, and she was married to Mark Greenman. Did you know that?
no,
Did you know that Kelly Labonte, or I'm sorry, Kelly Greenman at that point was communicating with Mark Jensen via email and saying, well, you know, I know what I'm going to do with my issue. What are you going to do with your issue? Were you aware that Kelly Greenman had sent that communication to Mark Jensen in the middle of October 1998?
no,
Were you aware that Mark Jensen responded that, well, you know, details, that's just noise in the greater picture of things? Were you aware that that's how he responded to the details that he was supposed to be taking care of? His wife and his children, they were just noise in the greater picture of things in Mark Jensen's estimation? Were you aware of that?
no,
Were you aware that during the course of the ensuing months and ensuing days, from the time he had this communication with Kelly Labonte or Kelly Greenman, right up to the time of Julie Jensen's death, there was not one single search on Mark Jensen's computer for a divorce attorney? Were you aware of that?
no,
Not one single search about a marital property agreement. Were you aware of that?
no,
There was not one single search about child custody. Were you aware of that?
no,
There was not one single search about anything relating to divorcing his wife or property maintenance or property division. Were you aware of that?
no,
But there were several searches about botulism, about, I don't know, pipe bombs. There was several searches using the anarchist cookbook looking for ways to kill your spouse. Were you aware of that?
Judge, I would object. That's not what those searches said.
Well, I think there was one search, how to kill your wife.
It was the sentencing of a pipe bomb person. So that's different. And remember, we advised the jury that just because it wasn't on the screen.
Right,
didn't
we'll
make it-
withdraw that last question.
Okay, so you were aware, you were not aware that Mark Jensen had gone on the internet and was looking up things like botulism, pipe bombs, a variety of other poisons. You weren't aware of that.
No,
Were you aware that, a word search was done for the unallocated space of Mark Jensen's computer? And the number one word that was searched more than that came up more often than all the other words was poison. Were you aware of that?
no,
Were you aware that Mark Jensen had several hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of penis photos on his work computer in 2002? Were you aware of that?
no,
You would agree that for a man to have hundreds and hundreds of penis photos on his computer, that's a very unusual thing. Would you agree?
yes,
It reflects an obsession, perhaps, an unhealthy obsession with male genitalia. Would you agree?
yes.
And if somebody
I mean,
was
unless
leaving
that's
these
your
penis
thing,
photos
and
all
then
around the house
you
for
know,
years and years and years and years,
I know plenty of
the fact that Mark
teenage
Jensen
boys
has
with
several
lots
hundred
of boobies
penis
probably on their
photos
computers.
on his computer, that might reflect that he's the person that's doing that.
An obsession.
Correct?
Possibly, yes,
It's a reasonable inference, isn't it?
yes,
Were you aware that Mark Jensen, in the early stages of his relationship with Kelly Labonte, she'd become Kelly Labonte again by this point, that he was asking her to describe in great detail the size, shape, and circumference of every penis she'd ever encountered in her life? Were you aware of that?
Judge, I would object as to relevance for this witness.
Well, I think he's asking her what she considered when she made her opinion.
But the understanding from the jury is that was after Miss Jensen had passed. So I'm not sure it's how it's relevant to this doctor's opinion as to cause and manner of death.
Actually, Your Honor, there's no indication that that conversation necessarily occurred after Julie Jensen's death.
I don't agree with that.
That's fine.
That's not a correct statement. So we'll go ahead, continue.
So did you answer that last question? I don't remember if you did or not.
I don't remember.
Okay, could the reporter read back the last question, please?
Were you aware Mark Jensen in the early stages of with Kelly Labonte began by this point that he was asking her to describe the size, shape, and circumference of everything she ever encountered?
No,
So in all the cases that you've testified before in your life and evaluated before in your life, have you ever encountered somebody who did something like that?
Objection relevance.
Well, I think you asked her about her experience and what sort of cases she's done.
I didn't ask her about the specific facts. I'm sure. I mean, it's just
You
not
talked
relevant.
about
to
some
this.
specific facts, poisoning and stuff like that.
That's her expertise, Judge. That's why I asked her that.
understand that. So go ahead, ask the question.
Could you read the question back, please?
So in all the cases that you evaluate, have you ever encountered somebody who did something like that?
yes,
You encountered somebody that had 2,200, or is it hundreds and hundreds of penis photos on their computer?
there have been plenty of cases I've been involved in where there's pornographic material on somebody's computer.
Okay, so you've encountered a case where a male suspect in a murder case had on his computer hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos of penises.
Not specifically as you described, no.
I have a question right now. Our break is coming really close. I don't want to interrupt your cross, but are you close?
Not even close. Not even close, Judge.
We're going to take a break. Take your break, folks. Hopefully you can get by here.
I mean, at this point, it's kind of like, all right, man, yeah, get to the, spare us the labor pains, give us the baby type thing, right? So, yeah, we're definitely dealing with one of the better back and forths we've had thus far in the case. But what I'd like to do is take a look over at this Murdaugh trial. And if you're unaware of the Murdaugh trial, so this is like the Low Country Murders of South Carolina. They made a HBO miniseries about this. This is a guy who their family basically was like a powerhouse family, right? And they ran, for lack of better terms, like South Carolina, like the DA's office, generational attorneys. This guy, his kid, like was drunk, drove a boat into a bridge, killed a girl. Nothing happened to the kid. Like they had a house cleaner, housekeeper, maid that died mysteriously at their house, fell down some steps. And then this guy, Alex Murdaugh, was getting brought up on all these. He was looking at all these charges for, extortion, or not extortion, for embezzlement and all these other like financial charges. And his wife and his son, who he's being tried for the murder of, were killed. And then there was an attempt on his life where someone tried to kill him, which didn't work. Turns out that he hired someone to kill him, and just crazy. It's just a wild case, and it's something that is, it's kind of personal too, because I've got people now that are from that area that knew the family. So we're going to be spending some time down there, getting to know them a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over to that trial for just a little bit. Oh, this is not sleeping, guys. Yeah, this is John. You're not wrong. These studio lights here aren't exactly forgiving either. So, but I'm looking weathered. Well, you're spot on. I'm feeling weathered. To be very clear. The HBO special called is the low. Here, let me see if I can't pull up well, I'm going to cut over to the trial real quick so we don't miss anything. So we can kind of, run back and forth. But here, maybe we can switch the glow of the light here. Maybe people are really giving me the business right now. I've been out in Wisconsin for the last 6 months, so not a lot of sun. Yeah, so let's do this real quick. We'll do this right here. Boom. All right. Bear with me for 1 minute here, guys. You guys are ruthless. Just right off the bat. So we're going to check this out for a little bit here. There we go. That's the Low Country, the Murdaugh dynasty. It's wild. You guys. I encourage anyone to go watch the documentary. At least pull up some stuff on YouTube and check it out. It's a trip. It's definitely a trip. Thank you, Cindy, for that one. Shelly is going to be back in a minute, Amy.
I have 2 photographs. I'm going to use the Elmo in just a moment to show this witness. I'm going to offer these into evidence without objection by the state, as I understand it.
Once they're marked, I have no objection. I would note they're graphic and they need to be shielded from view.
Elmo ready?
They can be marked. What would the exhibit numbers be for the defense? If Defense 1 and 2 are admitted without objection.
Okay. So, thank you. I'm going to first show you the picture. See if you can identify it, please.
That would be a picture of Paul,
And the second one, which would be exhibit number 2.
picture of Maggie.
When you say picture of Paul and picture of Maggie, these are crime scene photos, correct?
They appear to be yes.
Is this what you saw that night?
Yes.
Both of these pictures
Yes.
accurately depict what you saw that night.
Yes.
So as you look at this, I want to make sure I understand. One of Paul's feet is still inside. This is the feed room behind him, correct?
Yes.
And this is his head, lots of blood, and this would be a part of his brain lying next to him, correct?
I don't know if that's part of his brain or not.
All right, so it's fair to say you didn't know whether that was part of his brain. When you first saw him, you didn't know whether his injuries were catastrophic and he was dead, or did you?
It was very clear that it was catastrophic.
Okay. That's right. Now, when you came upon the scene, clearly this feed room was part of the crime scene, correct?
Yes.
Now, you're taught to keep the crime scene pristine, correct?
As pristine as possible, yes.
There was no reason for you to go in there, was there?
Me at the time, no.
Okay. Was there any reason for the police, before the SLED crime folks showed up, was there any reason for you all to go in there?
There was no reason for me to go in there. I cannot speak if there was a reason for another officer to have gone in there.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you all have any sort of crime scene expert with you that night, someone that processes crime scenes?
Investigators do process crime scenes.
Okay. Do you remember going in that meeting?
I don't remember if I did specifically or
But
not.
you shouldn't have if you did, correct?
It's not to say that I shouldn't have. If there was something that needed to be done in there, then yes.
I guess what I'm getting at is, I think and you would agree with me, one of the cardinal rules of a crime scene is keep it pristine. Don't walk over things. Try to preserve tire tracks, get pictures of them, footprints, all those sorts of things. Was somebody with the officers with you, were you in charge of the scene?
I was in charge of the deputies that were under my immediate supervision until someone higher than me had arrived on scene.
And were those deputies directed by you or anyone to do something to preserve the tire tracks, pictures, cordon them off, cover them up?
I did not give anyone that instruction, no.
So you didn't do that. In terms of Paul, where Paul was laying, was anybody instructed, put a cordon around him? There's no reason to go into the feed room. There's no reason to do anything obtrusive until the SLED crime scene process. They're on the way at this point, right?
I believe they were, yes.
And so if, okay, so let's put the other one. And identify this for me, please.
That's Maggie Murdoch. Your Honor, may we approach here briefly? Stop talking.
Sorry. And can you identify this for the jury, please?
That picture?
Yeah.
It's Maggie Murdoch.
After she's been killed.
That's correct.
And by the way, when you saw her was it apparent that she was deceased? You believe, but have you ever seen a dead body before?
I have seen multiple, yes.
Many, right?
Yes.
So you're sort of an expert in this area, who's dead, who's not, who ought to get EMS there to check them out or not, correct? You make that call often.
Yes.
Okay. But you could understand, obviously, Alex Murdaugh's concern that they might be alive, that maybe, you're not saying that he shouldn't be concerned that somebody check out both Maggie and Paul to make sure they were dead, right?
He was very concerned about that, yes.
Okay. Now, as to Maggie Murdaugh, we see these numbers. Did y'all do these numbers, or were they done after y'all were there?
I don't know when those numbers were done. They were not placed by myself.
Or your team?
I can't say that for sure, certain.
We see that in the video that they're putting down yellow tape. They're not putting these down, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you also, according to the video we saw, a number of your officers are walking around marking where cartridges are, right?
They were.
Did they pick any of them up?
No, not to my knowledge.
Well, later on, we see them talking to you and others on the video where they're saying these rounds came from a blackout. They were blackout rounds. For blackout.
300 blackout, yes, sir.
Right. Did they get down on their hands and knees and look, or did they?
You would have to ask them. I don't know what they did to know that they were 300 blackout rounds.
Well, who were those officers that were walking around her without a light on, perhaps stepping on evidence, correct? Who were those officers?
Deputy McDowell and Deputy Pruitt were both in that area.
Were they doing that pursuant to your instruction?
They were not specifically instructed to do it. They just took the initiative to do it.
Okay, I don't know. I want to play.
You ready? Do I have to turn down the law? Are we good? Yep, we're good.
Close
desk over there. That's all.
Okay, so this is, your officer is putting a sheet on Paul's body?
Not putting a sheet on, the sheet was already there.
Already there, okay, continue.
So people just don't really. Fire rescue might have some more sheets we can steal. That's why it shouldn't be like law enforcement. There is law enforcement.
Who's that standing inside the feed room?
Just inside that doorway was
Yeah.
Deputy McDowell.
Okay, were you present? Oh, is that your body cam? So you're watching him do it, right?
That's correct.
Should he have done that?
Stand where he's standing.
Standing inside the feed room?
It's part of the crime scene. We're all standing inside the crime scene.
Inside what?
The crime scene, we are all standing in the same crime scene.
I understand the same crime scene, but clearly you believe, based on discussion, and everyone in your unit believed, that the fatal shot was made where he basically standing, correct? That, in that area?
Where we are all standing.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Is that procedure to walk around on top of an area where shots have been fired? That perhaps, and I think even in this, they're talking about tissue or brain matter laying there. I mean, aren't you supposed to, you don't put anything on your feet?
Question, there's not a question in that statement.
Mr. Stain, you must pose questions.
Did you in any way have your men or women put protective gear on their feet? I saw you put gloves on, but did they put anything to insulate themselves from contaminating the scene?
On their feet, no.
In many instances, departments around the country have people dress in a gown to keep their DNA, their hair from contaminating the scene. Did you do that?
We do not on road patrol with Colleton County as standard practice, no.
You do not do that.
Not a standard practice, no.
Have you ever done that?
I have not.
Have you ever had something covering your feet when you're walking on a crime scene?
I couldn't tell you that for sure.
Now, if we later on find, and did you notice bloody footprints? Well, first of all, did you notice bloody footprints inside the feed room?
I don't remember seeing any.
Sorry?
I don't remember seeing any bloody footprints.
Okay. If there were bloody footprints in the feed room, could they have been created by you or your men?
They could have been created by anyone walking in that area, sure.
And you're walking in there, or your men are walking in there, correct?
Yeah, correct.
And you think that's standard operating procedure?
Well, you do your best not to contaminate anything.
And this is your best?
What you're looking at right now is standard procedure.
To walk in an area where there's blood, where there's brain matter, where there's, and I believe there was wadding laying on the floor?
I don't recall.
But you would agree with me that you have these procedures so that you don't contaminate the crime scene, so that you don't destroy evidence like those tire tracks or those footprints, or leave your DNA, or in some way alter the scene so that if, I mean, you would agree with me, so that, let me finish the question, so that if there is exculpatory or inculpatory evidence that would help you find the perpetrator and prosecute him, or evidence that would clear somebody, that was destroyed. Some of that was destroyed that night because your department, and maybe even SWED, didn't preserve that evidence. Isn't that correct?
I'm not sure if I fully understand your question.
The question is this: if you are exfoliating, you're standing, your men are standing in the spot, and there was evidence there, or the tire tracks that weren't preserved, or the footprints that weren't preserved, that evidence could either incriminate somebody or exculpate somebody. Could, correct?
Could, yes.
That's why you don't do this, right?
That's why you don't contaminate the evidence, correct?
Just a couple more questions. You put yellow tape around the kennel, right?
We put it around the whole area.
Did you put it so that folks couldn't drive in and out?
They were not to go past where my vehicle was parked. I believe that was the extent of the yellow tape.
But between your vehicle and the entrance, there was none of those tire tracks were preserved.
Entrance of,
The property. That if somebody had driven into the property
you mean from the main road of Moselle
from the
Road?
main road,
All the vehicles were coming in on that driveway.
right? So if somebody had come in and left, who committed the murders, whatever tire tracks that were left were obliterated by your men. Is that right?
It's possible.
Were you there when the coroner arrived?
Given my extent of the time there, I would assume so, but I don't remember.
But you don't remember
specifically.
seeing the coroner.
I may have. I don't remember specifically.
Apparently, according to the body cam, you didn't talk to him.
Not on my body camera, but it could have been after the body camera was turned off. I don't know.
And why did you turn it off?
Why was the body camera turned off?
Yes.
Once my specific job of doing any primary investigation after my initial arrival is completed, and I'm not going to be doing anything further to investigate, it's no longer needed.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. You were asked a series of questions about contaminating evidence. Are you aware that any evidence was contaminated in this case?
I'm not.
Did you engage in everything you could to avoid contaminating evidence?
Yes.
Did you in fact instruct your deputies, set up a crime scene and instruct them to avoid areas where evidence might be contaminated?
We did everything we possibly could to avoid contaminating.
Do your officers all have basic training in trying to avoid contamination of evidence?
Yes.
Are you also, though, as first responders in a fluid situation, doing the best you can to assess what's going on?
Correct.
It's not your job to do the actual crime scene investigation work, is that correct?
Not at all.
You were asked about whether or not you'd had any meetings with prosecutors. Is it common for law enforcement witnesses or any witnesses to meet with the prosecutors prior to a trial?
Very common.
Okay. Did anybody ask you to do anything but express your accurate and honest opinions and observations about what you observed at this scene?
No.
You were asked about this particular shotgun right here, this 12-gauge shotgun. This is the shotgun that Alan Murdoch had when you arrived at the scene. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were asked about the shells right here. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you unload this weapon?
I did not.
Was it unloaded by somebody else after you turned it over to them?
Yes.
You asked a little bit about the 300 blackout casings or cases that were at the scene. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And just real quick, explain to the jury what a casing or a case is, please.
So a casing would be what would be left after the projectile has been fired through a weapon.
After it had been fired, the shell that comes out of the gun and lands on the ground near the victim. Is that
That's
correct?
That's correct.
So it's the remnants of a fired round. Is that right?
That's correct.
There were multiple ones of those blackouts surrounding Maggie. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You were asked a lot about the tire tracks, and you just happened to notice those over behind the defendant's vehicle. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we had a still image put into evidence, exhibit number 5. This is it right here, which is the still image. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. And the still image doesn't reflect as good as what the video does. Is that right? You can see
The video shows it much better.
much better. All right. Were these like tracks in the dirt, or were these just impressions in the grass, in the dewy grass?
They appear to be impressions on the dewy grass.
They weren't like tracks in the dirt that you saw, correct?
No.
All right. I'm going to go back to the video. I'm playing it at approximately 25 minutes and 11 seconds.
See? Okay. From earlier, but okay. Only 2 on mine. Did you go out this way at all?
For the Jensen trial. We'll come back to Murdoch maybe tomorrow. We'll check on things, but we're into the Jensen trial, so we're gonna go back over. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Right.
Hemorrhaging on the second, third, and fourth rib of Julie's rib cage.
Yes.
It wasn't visible on the outside, but it was visible on the inside when he did the classic Y incision and pulled the skin back. You remember that?
Correct.
And Dr. Chambliss had not seen the crime scene photo when he did the autopsy. Were you aware of that?
I don't know.
Well, now I'm going to direct your attention to the item that's on the screen up here. I'm going to blow it up a little bit. Now, can you see some hemorrhaging along the rib cage that the doctor had testified about?
Yes.
And the hemorrhaging along the rib cage kind of lines up with where Julie's arm is down here, doesn't it? Would you agree with that?
I would say it's kind of hard to say, but
Well, would you agree, doctor, that the hemorrhaging on the rib cage, that a reasonable explanation for the hemorrhage on the rib cage is that it's consistent? Let's put it this way. Would you say it's consistent with Mark Jensen's description of the manner in which he murdered Julie Jensen by sitting on her and shoving her face in a pillow? Would you agree that the injuries on the rib cage and the condition of the body at that point, that those factors are consistent with what Mark Jensen is alleged to have said to Aaron Dillard?
I find that strange because if
I
there's,
just ask you whether it's consistent or not.
I
Is it
don't think
consistent?
it's consistent.
You think that the injuries in the rib cage and the manner in which Julie Jensen is laying there is inconsistent with what Mark Jensen is alleged to have said to Aaron Dillard?
I think it's strange that there would not be external signs of injury and internal signs like this that we're looking at are non-specific post-mortem artifact. And I say that because, as we discussed earlier, in my expert witness practice for the Department of Justice, I look at tons and tons and tons, hundreds of opioid deaths, and even more recently because of fentanyl. And invariably, on just about any autopsy report that I review, it is not uncommon to see post-mortem artifact, including petechiae and including hemorrhage, which is an artifact. It's due to the putrefaction process and post-mortem change. And so in the example that I told you about my trash compactor man, he was obviously compressed. He had a large amount of compression on him, and he didn't die, but he had the external signs of compression asphyxia. And so if the thought is that it's consistent that this post-mortem hemorrhage on the inside was caused by something on the outside, and there's no signs of it on the outside, I would say that's inconsistent.
Now, doctor, we were talking about your extraordinary qualifications, and in order for you to become a medical toxicologist, you had significant amount of training beyond that of other physicians. Is that true as a medical toxicologist?
Say that again.
in order to become board certified as a medical toxicologist, you had a very significant amount of additional training and specific experience beyond that of most other physicians. Isn't that true?
Yes.
And in order to become board certified as an emergency room physician, you had a significant amount of experience and training beyond that of other physicians in order for you to be even qualified to sit for to be board certified as an emergency room physician. Isn't that true?
Yes.
And you're not board certified as a forensic pathologist. Isn't that true?
Correct. I already said that.
Yes, and I'm just emphasizing that point again. So, and yet, Dr. Chambliss and Dr. Mainland are both board certified forensic pathologists.
Correct.
And both Dr. Chambliss and Dr. Mainland indicated that these injuries, that this presentation of Julie Jensen's body at the time she was found, and that autopsy photo, combined with Mark Jensen's alleged confession to Aaron Dillard, that his description is consistent with the findings at autopsy and the crime scene photo, but you're denying that.
Well, you're asking me my opinion. I, of course, find it strange that these two highly qualified forensic pathologists reviewed the same material and neither one of them thought about asphyxiation as a possibility given the scientific evidence until it was asked of them to retroactively show if it was consistent.
You think that's what happened? You don't think Dr. Chambliss had indicated at the outset that she could have been asphyxiated? You don't think that? You weren't aware of that?
I'm not aware of that, but I know that there was the consideration of that because of petechiae on the inside, but petechiae on the inside is a non-specific finding in every autopsy.
What I asked you was this. You were unaware of the fact that Dr. Chambliss from the outset had suspected asphyxia in this case? You were unaware of that?
I'm not aware of what he was aware.
You're unaware of the fact that at the testimony, the initial hearing in this matter, Dr. Mainland said she could not rule out asphyxia as being a contributing factor in the death of Julie Jensen?
Correct. If you're interpreting these petechiae in a vacuum.
I didn't ask you what Dr. Mainland was evaluating. I just asked you whether you were aware that at the time that Dr. Mainland testified at the first hearing, she could not rule out asphyxia as a contributing factor.
I'm not aware of what she testified at the time of the first hearing.
So, Doctor, when we look at your differential diagnosis, you concluded ethylene glycol poisoning was the cause of death in this matter.
Correct.
And you didn't offer an opinion as to the manner of death in this matter. Is that correct?
I did.
Oh, you did? You indicated you had an opinion to a reasonable medical certainty as to the manner of death?
I did.
What's your opinion to a reasonable medical certainty as the manner of death?
Undetermined.
Oh, I see. So you couldn't distinguish between possible homicide or suicide. You just said because of the information you had, you couldn't make a choice between homicide and suicide.
Correct.
Or accident.
Correct.
Well, so let's consider some of the information that the jury has heard to help them decide between homicide and suicide. And now I'm going to approach and I'm going to start writing things down again. You considered some of the things that Mark Jensen said, correct? You considered some of the things that Mark Jensen said, correct?
Correct.
And acknowledging that Mark Jensen is the accused murderer in this case, correct?
Correct.
So you would acknowledge that in determining reliable versus unreliable, if a person actually murdered somebody, they might be an unreliable source of information about that victim's what that victim was like in the weeks and months preceding her death. Would you agree with that?
Correct.
So when Mark Jensen wrote she'd lost, we'll put this on. When Mark Jensen wrote that she'd lost 15 pounds in 1 month, that would kind of suggest loss of appetite, extreme emotional upset. It's consistent with suicide, isn't it?
It's consistent with depression. It's not necessarily consistent with suicide.
Well, that's a good point too. I mean, most people that are depressed don't commit suicide, right?
Yes.
The overwhelming majority of people who are depressed do not commit suicide, correct?
I'm not sure what the statistics are.
Well, would it sound like maybe 4 in 100,000 for women who are 40 to 45? Does that sound about right?
I don't know.
Okay, well, let's maybe as high as 9 out of 100,000 women who are age 40 to 45 die by suicide. It's a very low number, isn't it?
I honestly don't know.
Well, most of us want to live and most of us don't want to commit suicide. But those of us who do commit suicide, oftentimes they're depressed, right?
Yes.
Now, and if a person is depressed, they might lose 15 pounds in a single month, right?
Or gain.
Yeah, or gain. And so if Mark Jensen is saying that Julie Jensen lost 15 pounds in a single month, but we know for a fact that's not true. I mean, you know, as you're sitting here right now, that Julie Jensen did not lose 15 pounds in 1 month, don't you?
Yes, we've already discussed that.
Yes. So she weighed 123 pounds, 9'1". And on 12'1", she weighed 115 pounds. So that's an 8-pound difference. In, September, October, November, December. So in 3 months, she lost 8 pounds. That's way different than 15 pounds in 1 month, right?
I would submit that 8 is different from 15.
Yes. And then on 12/4/98, estimated approximately 110 pounds. And none of those figures add up to anything approximately close to 15 pounds in a single month, does it?
No.
And then with suicide, I mean, Mark Jensen was talking about Julie being depressed, right?
Correct.
But were you aware that Julie Jensen had told her neighbor, Tad Voigt, that she was concerned that Mark Jensen, her husband Mark Jensen, was trying to poison her? Were you aware of that?
I was aware of that, yes.
And that she was concerned, that she didn't know if he was trying to poison her or if he was trying to make it look to her like he was poisoning her so that she would do something stupid and then she'd lose the children. Were you aware of that kind of conundrum, that problem that Julie was having in making a decision?
I am aware of that.
And were you aware that Julie Jensen had told her son's third grade school teacher, Teresa Fazio, that she thought her husband might be trying to kill her?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And then within a few days of Julie Jensen sharing with Thaddeus Voigt and with Teresa Fazio her fear that her husband might be trying to kill her, within a few days of that, she ends up dead. Were you aware of that?
I'm aware of that.
Would you agree that those statements are more consistent with this being a homicide than a suicide?
Yes.
So Julie's statements are consistent with a homicide. Mark Jensen's statements are consistent with suicide, right?
Correct.
So gee, you don't know what to decide. Is it homicide or is it suicide? So then, in addition to Julie's statements, we have the murder suspect having a sexual relationship with his girlfriend in the months preceding Julie's death. That's more consistent with it's a motive, isn't it? It's a motive for Mark Jensen to murder his wife?
It could be.
Then we have the years-long sadistic humiliation and harassment of Julie Jensen apparently at the hands of her husband, that's also indicative of a homicide, isn't it?
If he was indeed the person that did that, then perhaps.
Okay. Sadistic. Years long harassment. And humiliation. And then we have Mark Jensen planning a trip with his girlfriend, a cruise with his girlfriend. That's also consistent with a homicide, isn't it?
I wouldn't go as far as to say that's consistent with a homicide. I would say that is consistent with somebody having an affair. You're a crappy husband, you're an adulterer, but that doesn't equate to suicide. I mean, homicide.
Certainly not. But if he's planning a trip with her, unless he's planning to bring his wife along, he's either lying to Kelly, just stringing her along, or if he's telling Kelly the truth about wanting to go on this trip with her, he's got to do something with his wife. You would agree with that?
No, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I mean, there are husbands that tell their wives they're going on a business trip and they're not. The salacious details are not part of my differential diagnosis.
Oh. But Mark Jensen's representations to you are?
Mark Jensen's representations were taken at face value to consider, as well as evidence about Julie Jensen and her mental state. And there are facts on both sides that would lead someone to determine whether it's a homicide or a suicide. That is not for me to weigh or decide. And so the point and my role here is I'm aware of these different facts, bad facts for both sides, but my role is to make sure that there is not a misconception in the science, in the toxicology, that suggests one way or another, not to be misconstrued that a teaspoon or a half a teaspoon in a stomach means homicide, or that a whole stomach full of ethylene glycol means a suicide. What I'm trying to express is that my analysis, even though I'm aware of these facts on both sides, my cause of death is ethylene glycol poisoning, which is differential diagnosis, because differential diagnosis is a diagnosis and cause of death is a diagnosis. This chart right here with homicide and suicide is manner of death, not cause of death. And I'm aware of both sides. That goes into a manner of death analysis, not cause of death analysis. And my analysis is focused on the science and to represent that there is nothing toxicologically that defines whether this is a suicide or a homicide. And I am not making a opinion about the salacious details that have been presented in this case, which is why my cause of death is ethylene glycol poisoning and my manner of death is undetermined. It is not for me to decide.
But you did render an opinion as to manner of death. You said it was undetermined, right?
I did.
And in arriving at your manner of death, you did look at the salacious details. You consider what Mark Jensen said about Julie being depressed, right?
I did.
You did consider what Mark Jensen said about her losing 15 pounds in a single month, correct?
I am aware, and I know you like making this discrepancy over and over again. I would hope that nobody would, make a statement based on what someone says someone weighs, because I have to estimate people's weights all the time, and I'm a seasoned physician and I don't do it correctly. And I'm sure that he didn't weigh her every day, and it was an estimation. The difference between 8 and 15 is negligible, and I just took it not at the amount, but that there was weight loss. Not that that means something.
You also considered Dr. Borman's analysis, and Dr. Borman had said that she started manifesting signs of depression on September 1st, 1998, right?
Correct.
But she'd never manifested any signs or indication of depression before September 1st, 1998, correct?
I don't remember exactly when he said, but there were things in his notes and in his testimony describing a declining mental status.
Well, September 1st, 1998, he talks about Julie Jensen being depressed, correct?
Correct.
Now, were you aware that it was in August of 1998 that Mark Jensen started communicating with Kelly Labonte and going to St. Louis? And were you aware that it was in September of 1998 that Kelly Labonte said that that's when she first started having sexual relations with Mark Jensen? Were you aware of that?
I'm not aware of when it exactly happened, no.
Would you agree that a married woman with 2 small children who suspects her husband is having an affair, that might cause her to become upset or depressed?
Yes.
So that might account for Julie Jensen starting to show signs of depression and being upset on September 1st, 1998, if she suspected that her husband was having an affair, right?
Correct.
And by December 1st, 1998, by this time, Mark Jensen's affair with Kelly Labonte was in full bloom. That might be another reason for Julie Jensen to be distressed, to be distraught, to be upset, right?
It could be.
And especially by December 1st, 1998, if Julie Jensen was telling her neighbors and her son's 3rd grade school teacher that she thought her husband was trying to kill her, that would be another reason for her to be distressed and upset, correct?
Sure.
And that might account for her weight loss. If she's between 123 down to 115 pounds, if she thought her husband was trying to poison her, she might be a lot more careful what she's eating, wouldn't she?
Perhaps.
And then when you consider this thing over here for depression and so forth, Dr. Borman asked Julie on December 1st, 1998, if she was suicidal, didn't he?
Yes.
And she specifically said no, she would never commit suicide because of her children, correct?
Correct.
So that's indication of not suicidal. Wouldn't you agree that a young woman who says, my children are everything for me, I live for my children, I would never commit suicide because of my children, a statement like that is an indication of a lack of suicidal intent?
At that exact moment in time.
On December 1st, 1998. Now, then, at the time of Julie's death, you talked about the ethylene glycol on board, but she also had other things on board, right?
Yes.
What else did she have on board?
She had Ambien.
Ambien. Now, when Dr. Borman evaluated Julie Jensen on December 1st, 1998, he made reference in his testimony to something called SIGECAPS. Have you ever heard of SIGECAPS? SIGECAPS?
No.
Well, it's the first thing is SIGECAPS. The first letter stands for suicide. So and it's kind of shorthand for the things that the doctor goes through. Suicide, interest.
Judge, I would object because Dr. Borman actually said he didn't do that when he testified.
Actually, it was Dr. Borman's testimony that I got it from. So
Dr. Borman acknowledged that it was a thing, but said that that's not what he used when doing the assessment.
Let's ask another question.
So what you're going to say? Oh, what were you going to say?
It's called SIGECAPS, not SIGECAPS.
Okay, so I got it wrong. Okay, well, that's why I'm a lawyer, not a doctor. So it's SIGECAPS. What is
Sorry, I didn't know what you were talking about.
So, my apologies.
I thought you were making up some kind of suicide capsule or something.
So SIGECAPS. What's SIGECAPS?
SIGECAPS.
SIGECAPS.
So forgive me because I'm not a psychiatrist that does this every day, but it's kind of a list of things that psychiatrists go through, asking questions about their mental state, appetite, and their mood and things like that, and kind of come up with a score to rate somebody's depression.
Okay. Well, Dr. Borman indicated that Julie told him she was not suicidal, and that she lived for her children. And by the way, there's a number of other people that said that about Julie Jensen too. Are you aware of what her neighbors said about her? That her neighbors all said that Julie Jensen was a profoundly devoted, loving, kind, and sensitive woman, that she loved her children. She would do anything for her children. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
So Dr. Borman had indicated she said she was not suicidal. And also, now back in 90 or 91, Julie Jensen was seeing a guy by the name of Paul DeFazio, a therapist. And he also said she was not suicidal at the time that he was seeing her back in 1990 or 91. Were you aware of that?
Correct.
So 2 different doctors indicated that she did not appear to be suicidal, correct?
Correct.
One of them just days before she died, correct?
Correct.
Were you aware that, let's get back to this thing about the other stuff on board. She had ethylene glycol on board. What else did she have on board?
So we said Ambien.
Ambien. Well, that could be either homicide or suicide, right?
Sure.
So we'll just kind of put this down here. What else was on board?
Librium.
What else?
Paroxetine or Paxil.
I'll just write Paxil.
Yeah.
What else?
And Benadryl.
So Benadryl, Ambien, Librium, Paxil, and ethylene glycol.
Correct.
Anything else on board, or was that it?
I'm sorry?
Anything else on board, or was that it?
That's it.
So, doctor, as a medical toxicologist, certainly you're familiar with with Ambien, correct?
Correct.
And you know that Dr. Borman gave Mark Jensen 10 Ambien pills on December 2nd. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
And were you aware that he gave Julie Jensen 3 Ambien pills between the time that he got home from that appointment and the morning of December 3rd, 1998?
I don't know whether he gave them, she took them, but there were 3 missing.
So, well, according to Mark Jensen, he gave her 3 Ambien pills. Were you aware of that?
I am aware of that statement, yes.
I mean, I'm talking about the statement he gave to Detective Ratsburg. He told Detective Ratsburg he gave her a pill when he got home. He gave her another Ambien later that night, and he gave her a 3rd Ambien the morning of December 3rd. Were you aware of that?
I'm aware of that. I just don't remember exactly when.
And that's consistent also with what Mark Jensen told Aaron Dillard. Were you aware of that?
I don't recall.
Now, according to Mark Jensen, when he was both speaking to Detective Ratsburg and when he was speaking with Aaron Dillard, Mark Jensen indicated to both of those persons that Julie Jensen was awake at around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning of December 2nd, and that she appeared to, in the early morning hours of December 2nd, and that she appeared to be, she said, I'm feeling drunk. You know, I feel like I'm drunk. And that Mark Jensen indicates that he took her to the computer and showed her this paroxetine list of possible side effects, and one of them was vertigo and a variety of other things that might explain her being intoxicated. Do you remember hearing about that?
Yes.
And it was after that. It was after he'd done that in the early morning hours of December 2nd that he went to see Dr. Borman mid-morning December 2nd and asked Dr. Borman for something to help Julie sleep. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Now, And Mark Jensen told that to both Paul Ratsberg and to Aaron Dillard. So, and furthermore, Dr. Borman indicated that Mark Jensen came to him and said that he needed to get something to help Julie sleep. You're aware of that?
I am.
So it's a pretty reliable scenario that actually Mark Jensen did in fact go see Dr. Borman on the early morning hours of December 2nd or mid-morning December 2nd, say between 10:30 and 11 o'clock. And
George, I would object as to the time. Dr. Borman did not testify to that.
okay, I'll rephrase it. According to evidence that will be presented in this case, Mark Jensen filled the prescription for the Ambien at around 11:13 a.m. on the morning of December 2nd, 1998. So that kind of indicates that sometime before 11:12 or 11:13 a.m., he'd obtained the prescription for Ambien from Dr. Borman. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes.
Now, according to Dr. Borman, he indicated that it was to be administered at night, correct?
Correct.
And that's typically when you give somebody Ambien, isn't it? Before they go to bed at night, right?
Correct.
But according to Mark Jensen, both in speaking with Detective Ratsberg and in speaking with Aaron Dillard, he gave Julie Jensen a dose of Ambien as soon as he got home from the doctor. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
That's not what Dr. Borman had prescribed, was it?
Probably not.
And Mark Jensen explained to Aaron Dillard that he needed the Ambien so that Julie would sleep through the adverse symptomology of ethylene glycol poisoning. Were you aware of that?
I am now, yes.
And that's a pretty good way to do it, isn't it?
Objection argumentative.
Rephrase it, Mr. Chairman.
Well, if Mark Jensen wanted Julie Jensen to sleep through the symptomology of ethylene glycol poisoning, giving her Ambien would assist him in accomplishing that objective, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And then, according to Mark Jensen, talking to Aaron Dillard, now not talking to Detective Ratsberg, Aaron Dillard indicated that he administered a second dose of ethylene glycol to Julie Jensen in the evening of December 2nd, along with a mixture of juice and antifreeze. Now, that second dose of Ambien, that would have been about the time that Dr. Borman was expecting him to give her the first dose of Ambien, wouldn't it be?
Correct.
And certainly, Dr. Borman was not expecting Mark Jensen to administer a dose of ethylene glycol, was he?
I wouldn't think so.
Yes.
Judge,
But
I
if you're
would
gonna-
object as to argumentative and not relevant for this witness.
A question and answer will stand. Go ahead, Mr. Jambres.
And, Doctor, ethylene glycol is by itself an odorless, sweet-tasting substance, isn't it?
It is odorless. Laboratory grade ethylene glycol is very sweet. There are bittering agents that are added to antifreeze.
There are now. But in 1998, there were additives to antifreeze, but they didn't have a requirement of bittering agents in the state of Wisconsin. Were you aware of that?
Well, I know that the bittering agents were added in the late 1990s, and it kind of varied from place to place. So I believe you that if there weren't, then it would have a sweet taste.
But automotive antifreeze is not pure ethylene glycol, is it? I mean, automotive antifreeze does have additives to it, and they're not added to make it taste better. They're added to prevent car systems from getting rust. It's got rust inhibitors in it, right?
Truth be told, I am not an expert on general automotive knowledge, so I don't know.
Doctor, we've stumbled upon something that I know more about than you do. So you're unaware that automotive antifreeze has rust inhibitors contained within it?
Never really thought about it.
Okay, well, in any event, the ethylene glycol that Julie Jensen was ingesting, we know this, it was not laboratory grade ethylene glycol, right? There's no reason to think that.
Correct.
The off-the-shelf antifreeze that people buy is got a lot of, it's almost pure antifreeze. But it's got a lot of additives. It's got additives for automotive cars. For example, it's got a fluorescing agent in it, right?
Some of them do, yes.
And the fluorescing agent is so that mechanics, people who work on cars like me, can find out where, if a car is leaking antifreeze, we can see it using a black light.
Correct.
So in order to get somebody to unknowingly ingest ethylene glycol or antifreeze, it would be necessary to put it in another substance and dilute it, correct?
Correct.
Because otherwise the person would know they're drinking antifreeze, right?
Probably.
So fixing the ratio at, say, 1/3 antifreeze and 2/3 juice would be a good way, perhaps an effective way to disguise the presence of antifreeze in the substance that you're slipping to somebody.
Maybe.
So if in fact Mark Jensen did tell Aaron Dillard that on the evening of December 2nd, 1998, I administered a second dose of ethylene glycol to Julie Jensen by putting 1/3 antifreeze and 1/3 juice, and then I also gave her an Ambien pill. There's nothing in the medical and in the toxicological results that you saw at the time of Julie's death that would be inconsistent with what I just described, is there?
No.
And if Mark Jensen had told Aaron Dillard that the next morning he gave Julie Jensen a third dose of a third dose of Ambien, the third Ambien pill, there's nothing inconsistent with Julie Jensen's toxicological presentation at the time of her death that's inconsistent with that, is there?
Right. There's no way to look at a post-mortem drug level and say how many were administered and exactly when. And that goes for all of these post-mortem substances.
But you are aware that the medical examiner's office, the deputy medical examiner who was at the scene, collected all the items that were there, right? Including, I mean, he collected the Ambien that was there, right?
Judge, I would, this is actually, it wasn't the medical examiner. This is not correct.
Just rephrase it, Mr.
Okay, well, you are aware that whichever authority it was, they collected the Ambien at the scene. There were 7 Ambien pills left out of 10 Ambien pills. You were aware of that?
Yes.
So sometime between the point where Mark Jensen got them on November 13th, on December 2nd at 11:12 or 11:13 a.m., sometime between that point and the afternoon of December 3rd, 1998, when these pills were collected, somebody had used 3 Ambien pills, correct?
Correct.
And Mark Jensen's description that he administered 3 Ambien pills to Julie Jensen from between the morning of December 2nd, 1998 and the morning of December 3rd, 1998 would be consistent with that pill count, correct?
It would be consistent with the pill count, yes.
But it would be inconsistent with the doctor's prescription as to how much Ambien to give somebody, right?
Correct.
You would never, Dr. Borman never told Mark Jensen you should give her a pill as soon as you get home, another one tonight, and another one the following morning. He never said that to.
I don't believe so.
Because that's not consistent with the dosage for Ambien, is it?
Well, it's not the way that it's prescribed.
Well, especially for a woman who weighs between 110 and 115 pounds. I mean, if I took an Ambien pill, I weigh, we'll just say approximately 200 pounds, okay? So,
Well, I don't want there to be a discrepancy in your weight, though.
well, okay. We'll say 202.4 pounds, okay? Let's say I weigh approximately 202.4 pounds. I might be able to take maybe a couple of Ambien pills would have the same effect on me as one Ambien pill would have on Julie Jensen, right?
I don't know.
But certainly Dr. Borman would not have told Mark Jensen, yeah, you should give her 3 Ambien pills in the next 24 hours.
Judge asked and answered multiple times.
We'll take this answer. We'll move on. Go ahead, answer it, Doctor.
Correct.
Now, on the other hand, if Mark Jensen said, I gave her the first Ambien pill as soon as I got back from the doctor so that Julie would sleep through these symptoms, that's a pretty good course of action for somebody who wanted her to sleep to take, isn't it?
Judge, this is all asked and answered.
Go ahead and answer the question.
The purpose of Ambien is to make you sleep, whether it's through something or just to sleep through the night. So yes, Ambien is a medication that helps you sleep.
So let's move to, now we're going back to this differential between homicide and suicide. You are aware that Mark Jensen told the authorities that he went to work. He left for work sometime at 11 o'clock in the morning and arrived to work sometime around noon on December 3rd, 1998. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Are you aware that there are 3 people who were working in the office that day who testified in this courtroom in the last few days? Are you aware of that?
I'm aware, but I don't know what their testimony is.
Well, what if I were to tell you all 3 of them said that Mark Jensen never came to work on December 3rd, 1998? Would that suggest to you that maybe, well, either all 3 of them are mistaken or lying, or maybe Mark Jensen didn't go to work on December 3rd, 1998? Is that a possibility? Is it a possibility that Mark Jensen did not go to work on December 3rd, 1998?
Judge, I would object. I don't know how this witness can answer that.
It's a simple question. Well, there's a possibility.
I agree. Let's ask another question.
Well, we'll get back to this notion that Mark Jensen is an accused murderer. Can you see why somebody who's accused of murdering his wife sometime in the afternoon of December 3rd, 1998, would want to place him somewhere else on the afternoon of December 3rd, 1998?
Judge, I object as to argumentative, and again, outside this
That one
witness.
I'll allow. You can answer it. Go ahead, Doctor.
I'd ask the question be read back to the witness.
Well, getting back to the notion that Mark Jensen is an accused murderer.
Sorry, I can't hear through the glass.
Oh,
Here, just a minute. I'll get you the microphone.
no, thank you. We'll get back to the notion that Mark Jensen is an accused murderer. In the afternoon of December 3, 1998, would want to place himself somewhere else on December 3, 1998.
I suppose.
You are aware that Julie Jensen, that medical authorities arrived within 2 minutes of getting the phone call at 4:31 p.m. on December 3rd, 1998. Were you aware of that?
I don't remember the exact time frame that they responded.
So if the person who responded, a guy named Dave Wilkinson, a paramedic by the name of Dave Wilkinson, testified that he arrived within a few minutes of receiving the call, that's neither consistent or inconsistent with your understanding here of the evidence? Would you agree that if David Wilkinson testified to that and has records reflecting that would pretty much support the proposition that he arrived within minutes of receiving the phone call about Julie Jensen?
Yes.
And he testified that at the time he arrived there, there was some measure of rigor mortis that had set in. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
And the next day, rigor mortis was largely fully present in the body at the time of autopsy. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
So the fact that there was some rigor mortis present at the time that the time Dave Wilkinson arrived at around 4:32 or 4:33 p.m. on December 3rd, 1998, that's consistent with her being dead for quite some period of time. Would you agree?
Judge, I object. I don't know what quite some period of time means.
Well, I'll ask you about that in a minute.
Go ahead, ask the question.
So I request the question be read back.
So the fact that there was some rigor mortis present at the time that Dave Wilkinson arrived at 4:32, 4:33 p.m. on December 3, 1998, that's consistent with being
Dead for quite some period of time, correct?
quite some period of time, correct?
Is that true or not?
I do not want to comment about rigor mortis because it is very controversial in the literature about timing somebody's time of death by the presence or absence of rigor mortis. And that is something purely in the lane of a forensic pathologist, and I don't want to cross into their lane.
Okay. except when you're rendering an opinion as to manner of death.
I would object as argumentative because I don't
We'll
think
let
that's
that one answer, go ahead, answer that, and then we'll go somewhere else.
So you don't want to intrude upon their lane except when it comes to rendering an opinion as to manner of death.
So I don't believe that the manner of death is outside of my scope as a medical toxicologist in this particular case.
You know, my learned co-counsel reminded me of something else I should have asked you about, and I'm sorry I forgot to ask you about it. You were talking about on direct examination, defense counsel was asking you about whether or not Julie could have gotten out of bed on the morning of December 3rd, 1998. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And what is your opinion about whether Julie could have gotten out of bed on the morning of December 3rd, 1998?
Well, on the morning of December 3rd, based on the stages of ethylene glycol poisoning in and of itself, I don't see a reason why she would not have been able to get out of bed. As
Okay.
far as the other medications that would have added to intoxication, I don't have any reason to believe that she would be incapacitated and comatose by those medications. Certainly intoxicated, not necessarily comatose.
So you listed the stages of ethylene glycol poisoning, stage 1.
get you back in and running here. Not sure what happened there. Again, I'm running between a couple things at the same time right now. So,
And they were talking about third stage.
and we're back. Sorry.
Right at the bottom here, they put comatose and then death. So you've never seen a description of ethylene glycol poisoning where the third stage was terminated with comatose and then death? You've never seen that?
That's not what I just said.
No, so I'm asking, so you do agree that with regard to stage 3, that oftentimes the person becomes comatose and then they die, right?
If they go to stage 3 and they haven't been treated, then they will develop multi-organ dysfunction and can develop coma and death.
So you do know that Julie Jensen died, and she was dead on December 3rd, 1998, and your testimony, your conclusion is that the cause of death was ethylene glycol poisoning, but you're saying she was somewhere in stage 2 and trending into stage 3 at the time of her death?
Yes, what I said was there are 3 things we know definitively without all of the antemortem testing that we would do in a living patient. Number 1, she had a almost undetectable ethylene glycol level. That is in the setting of calcium oxalate crystals that were seen in the kidney, so we know that she was at least to stage 2. The third thing is that there was some evidence of renal tubular destruction on the autopsy, but as we just talked about, her BUN was 20 in her vitreous, which is slightly elevated. Now, the other way that I would want to know about renal
I don't feel like
failure
this witness
would
is
be
really
a measurement of
giving
her
the defense
creatinine,
the
which
results
if
they
you
were
were to go
looking
to your
for.
physician, they would measure that.
Sorry, there's a lot
We
of
don't
drilling
have
going on.
this, so I can only guess where her creatinine might be, but the BUN is somewhat helpful, and she certainly was not uremic. So we know an almost
Oh, yes,
undetectable
we see this,
ethylene
but
glycol
while they're
level,
talking,
calcium oxalate crystals
give you an idea
present,
of what we're doing.
some element
So,
of renal
let's see,
tubular
probably
destruction with a BUN of 20,
So I can
and she's dead.
state.
So my opinion would be that
moving
she
everything
died
into a
somewhere in
building.
stage 2, most likely because of calcium, which is where most of these deaths
We're having to
occur.
build all these
So,
sound.
Doctor, you just said we know, but that's actually what you know, what you believe, right? It's based on your analysis, and that's what you believe, correct?
Yes.
Were
Now, you aware of the fact that Mark Jensen told Detective Ratsberg and also told Julie's brother, Paul, that on the morning of December 3rd, Julie could not get out of bed? Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Were you aware of the fact that he had to prop her up in bed so her children could kiss her goodbye? Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Were you aware of the fact that he told Paul Griffin, and I think he also told Detective Ratsberg this, that she could barely speak, that she was grunting? Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Well, that's not suggestive or indicative of somebody who could get up out of bed and go on the computer at 9:42 a.m. on the morning of December 3rd, 1998, is it?
I don't know.
You don't know at the time that Julie Jensen is saying goodbye, that her children are coming in to kiss her goodbye, and she couldn't speak to them. She didn't speak to them, and she couldn't get out of bed at that time. And when her husband says she couldn't get out of bed, you don't think that's inconsistent with her going on the computer at 9:42 a.m. and looking up ethylene glycol poisoning?
Everything that you just described is a person that may be weak, but not comatose.
Do you think that somebody who's somewhere in the first or second stage of ethylene glycol poisoning is likely going to get up at, say, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning on December 3rd and look up unconsciousness? Do you think somebody might do that? who's suffering from ethylene glycol poisoning?
So that's very specific, but somebody that, as I described already, that is intoxicated by ethylene glycol should not be able to not get up and do things. I mean, they may be very weak, they may be very dizzy, they may be still feeling intoxicated.
But it wasn't just ethylene glycol, was it? Was it ethylene glycol and Ambien and Librium? There were other things in her system at the time, right?
Right, all of those things that could contribute to intoxication.
But also could contribute to her being less able to get up out of bed. And by the way, why, if somebody intentionally on their own took ethylene glycol and Librium and Zolpidem, why do you think they get up at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to look up unconsciousness on the computer?
Judge, I would object. This is outside her expertise.
Agree, sustained. Do you have a lot more across, Mr. Jim?
No, not a lot more, just a little bit more.
We're getting close to our lunch hour.
Oh, yes, we are. Just a moment, Judge. Let me confer
ahead.
with my more
Go
learned
ahead.
counsel here. There is one other thing, Doctor. Again, I'm very impressed with your background and your qualifications. I must have. How much did you charge for your to evaluate this case and then to come in here and testify?
Well, the first time I evaluated this case was a number of years ago, and I believe my rate was $450 an hour. And now, due to inflation, it's $750 an hour.
So, how much you're going to bill the defense for your testimony and for your analysis? Or have you already submitted a bill? So
I have
far?
not.
Oh, so how much? Do you know how much your bill is going to be?
It depends on how many more questions you have.
I'm getting hungry, so we're coming to the end here. So I'd say maybe 2 more questions, but how much do you think it's going to be?
It will probably be about 10,000 to 15,000.
Okay, that's very reasonable, I think. Thank you so much. No further questions.
All right. Are we going to have redirect?
We are going to judge, so we're going to probably have to do that after lunch.
Well, probably going to have to do it after lunch.
It'll be short, but I think that we should take a lunch
All
break.
right. Let's do 1:30 again, folks. Relax. Don't talk about the case. Thank you. You can take the defendant back for lunch. We are in recess.
All right, y'all. So what I'm going to do now is cut the feed until lunch is over. And then we'll come back up at 1:30. Those alien noises, Central Standard Time. So set your notifications up, and we will be seeing you guys very, very soon. Thanks for hanging out with us today. Appreciate it.